All right, hello everyone. We are live. So I thought I'd do a call-in show where I would talk about the Anthropic argument. So anyone's free to call in, and we'll talk about the Anthropic argument, the case for caring a great deal about shrimp welfare. We'll talk about the fine-tuning argument, and we'll talk about psychophysical harmony. I guess maybe I'll start with shrimp welfare. That's one I haven't talked about on the YouTube channel, though I have written a blog article about it called "The Best Charity Isn't What You Think." It's currently my pinned blog post that you can find if you go to the blog that's linked below. And I make the case that the Shrimp Welfare Project is the best charity that you can give to. Hey, Hayden, I saw your comment saying you enjoyed the last live stream, so glad to hear it. So the case for shrimp welfare is, it sounds weird, but I think it's pretty straightforward. What the Shrimp Welfare Project does is it tries to provide, it provides stunners. Well, it does a lot of things, but what it's doing with extra marginal dollars is it provides for these stunners, which are used to stun shrimp before slaughter. So what it does is it offers companies access to the stunners so long as they use them to stun at least 120 million shrimp. And the stunners are pretty cheap, only like like tens of thousands of dollars. And so per dollar that they get, in total, they save many tens of thousands of shrimp. About 15,000 shrimp, painful shrimp deaths are averted per dollar they've gotten. So per dollar they've gotten for about 15,000 shrimp, maybe more like 20,000 at the margins. But for every dollar they've gotten, about 15,000 shrimp have been given a painless death rather than a very painful death. Now, you might think, okay, why do we care about shrimp? Well, the first point is even if we only give shrimp a little bit of concern, it's just so cost effective that it ends up winning out. Second of all, the most detailed study about the extent of shrimp consciousness concluded that they suffer about 19% as intensely as we do. Now, there's, of course, high uncertainty. It might be much more. It might be much less, but crucially, it might be much more. So if this is right, then in expectation, a dollar given to the Shrimp Welfare Project averts about as much agony as if you made 3,000 human deaths painless, as if you made it so that 3,000 humans before they were sent to slaughter got a painless death rather than a very painful death. The way that the shrimp are normally killed is they're basically thrown on a big bucket of ice where they freeze and suffocate to death. So given this, every dollar given to the Shrimp Welfare Project in expectation prevents a very, very large amount of pain and suffering for these creatures that, according to our best evidence, can suffer. They respond to anesthetic. They display aversion learning. So, for example, if you give them an electric shock in an area, they'll avoid that area in the future. Crabs, which are like also decapods along with shrimp. Crabs can remember other crabs they fought for, I think, up to a day. They'll make trade-offs between pain and reward. So, for example, if you injure them, then they'll spend time grooming the wound, and they'll make trade-offs between that and eating food. There's abundant evidence, I think, that shrimp feel pain, or at least that it's plausible that shrimp feel pain. So given this, a dollar making it so that tens of thousands of shrimp are given a painful death is really effective. This means that if you give, say, $5,000, you prevent, on average, 75 million shrimp from being given a painful death, which is extremely cost-effective. Okay, so that's the Shrimp Welfare Project. By the way, everyone, you're free to call in. The link to join the stream is below. If you have disagreements or if you just want to chat about stuff, feel free to join. I guess the next thing maybe I'll talk about, now that we've covered the case for caring about shrimp welfare, is I'll maybe talk about I guess, okay, the next thing on my agenda is, so one response that people really like to give in response to the fine-tuning argument and to the anthropic argument and to pretty much every abductive argument for the existence of God is they make the stalking horse objection. Here's basically how the stalking horse objection goes. What they say is, look, you can build into your theistic hypothesis that God has a disposition to finely tune the constants or to create Beth-2 people or to create consciousness or to create psychophysical harmony. But crucially, I can build that into my atheistic hypothesis. And so long as you get to conjoin theism with the extra supposition that God would finally tune the constants, then I get to conjoin atheism with some extra supposition on which you get fine-tuning or you get psychophysical harmony. So therefore, it's not evidence for theism. Now, this, I think, okay, it is true that you can always come up with an auxiliary hypothesis and add it to your theory. But I think even if this is right, this doesn't affect whether or not the anthropic argument or the fine-tuning argument is a good argument. When you're assessing a good argument, what you want to know is, You want to know, is your argument the sort of thing that would convince a reasonable agnostic? Is it the kind of argument where if you were previously on the fence, you would be convinced by the argument? Now there, I think it's pretty clear that the anthropic argument is the kind of argument where if a person, or the fine-tuning argument, even if the objection that I'm addressing here, even if it's right, even if the stalking horse thing is correct, then I still think that it should convince a reasonable agnostic. Because if you're a reasonable agnostic prior to considering some argument, then you'll have considered the theistic and atheistic hypothesis. So you already have in mind a theistic hypothesis. Now, insofar as conditional on the theistic hypothesis, it's very likely that God would create a finely tuned universe, or at least not terribly unlikely. And conditional on the atheistic hypothesis, it's very unlikely. There are a whole range of things that the atheistic hypothesis might be conjoined with. It's highly unlikely that it would be conjoined with a disposition to create a finely tuned universe. Then it'll be very strong evidence for theism over atheism. Like, here's how I see it. Imagine that we're debating whether or not a person committed a crime. And so you point out that their DNA was found at the crime scene. So it seems like they committed the crime. And I say, no, I can do a stalking horse reply where I conjoin the hypothesis that they didn't commit the crime with the hypothesis that their DNA was found at the crime scene. And I come up with some alternative explanation. It's true that you can do that. And that might be right, depending on what the strength of the evidence is that they didn't do the crime. So for example, if they have a very solid alibi, and if there's some plausible story about how their DNA would get at the scene of the crime, then that's reasonable. But nonetheless, it would still be evidence that they committed the crime because it raises the likelihood. And so the sort of person who is on the fence would be convinced by this. And so even if the stalking horse argument is correct, then a person who is on the fence prior to considering fine-tuning, prior to considering psychophysical harmony, prior to considering the anthropic argument, would eventually be convinced. Hello, Saad. How are you? Hello. You're on mute. Hello. Okay, I'm going to remove you from the stage, but if you get your camera and stuff working, feel free to rejoin. But yeah, so this is how I feel about the stalking horse argument. And the crucial point is, it's not just like we arbitrarily build into theism some extra supposition that explains fine-tuning. So it's not like, well, we just add as a brute stipulation that God would have the disposition to create a finely tuned world. If that were the argument, then it wouldn't be successful. But what they claim, what theists claim, is that there are already things that the theist believes, namely that God is perfect, and that conditional on these things being true, it's pretty likely that you would get a finely tuned world, or the creation of every possible person, or psychophysical harmony. And so insofar as this is right, that we're arguing that it's likely conditional on our background assumption, while the naturalist has to conjoin some extra thing that they have no reason to believe to their theory, then it's going to be evidence for theism over naturalism. Now, it's true that if you think naturalism has a much higher prior, right? So maybe you think theism is this hyper-specific theory, then maybe you should still be a theist, or sorry, still be a naturalist, even after conjoining the theistic conjoins with that hypothesis. But I mean, I guess 2 points then. The first one is that it's still evidence for theism. So insofar as that's what the argument is supposed to do, raise the likelihood of theism relative to naturalism, with theism being defined as the supposition that there is a perfect being, then it's a successful argument. And it's successful in that it ought to convince people on the fence. And second of all, I don't know why you would be agnostic why you would think that the theistic hypothesis is very low prior. It's true that it's a specific hypothesis, and specific hypotheses often get a low prior. But specific hypotheses, they don't always get a low prior. Some hypotheses are very specific, but nonetheless, you should have a much higher prior in them than the non-specific hypothesis. So for example, consider all the variations of ways that the laws of physics might break down in particular isolated regions of space-time. Right? So maybe the laws of physics are roughly uniform across the universe, but there's a little patch where they work differently. There are infinite variations of that theory, assuming space is infinite. And even if it's not, I guess you can have the patches be increasingly small. So there are infinite variations of the theory. But nonetheless, the disjunct, all of them together, have a much lower probability than the hypothesis that there are uniform laws. And so similarly, it can be reasonable to adopt a very specific theory if the theory has a high prior, if the theory explains data well, and crucially, if the theory has the advantage of being simple and elegant, then it can be a better theory than all the variations of small tweaks to it. But theism is, I think, the simplest and most elegant theory. It involves taking one of the things that seems to be fundamental, namely consciousness, and positing that there's an unlimited consciousness. There's unlimited consciousness. Now, if there's unlimited consciousness, given that part of consciousness is will, then there would be no restrictions on will or on what the consciousness could do or on what facts it would bring to mind. So it would know everything. It would be able to do everything. So that would be the idea that theism has a high prior on account of it's a very simple theory. It just posits there's an unlimited consciousness. If you take one of the fundamental things like consciousness and you impose no limits on it, then you get a high prior probability. Okay, I have more things to talk about, I guess, if no one joins. But Kotev Scriabin, you say, I completely share the intuition of neutrality, i.e. that it's morally neutral to create happy sentient beings. What would be one go-to arg you would use to try to convince me otherwise? Okay, so this is a good question. And I have a paper on this that I have in Utilitas. So I think there is a pretty knockdown argument against it. So, okay, let's imagine you have two buttons. And what the first button does is it creates a happy person and it makes an existing person better off. So it doesn't make the person it creates is well off and it makes an existing person well off. So for example, suppose it creates a person who will live a happy life and they'll live to be 60 years old and 60 to be clear, and it will send a, say, $10,000 check in the mail to a random stranger. Okay, this button seems worth pressing. Even if you share the neutrality intuition, even if you think that it's good to make people happy but not to make happy people, well, so long as you can join a neutral thing, creating a happy person, with a good thing, namely making an existing person better off, then you've got something that's good overall. So on the supposition, on the intuition of neutrality, this is still a good thing to do. Okay, so this first button is worth pressing. Now let's imagine you have a second button. And what the second button does is it retracts the benefit to the existing person. But it makes it so that the second person, the newly created person, is vastly better off. Okay, so rather than, say, living 60 years and living a happy life and sending a $1,000 check in the mail, the $1,000 check in the mail goes away before it's been sent if you press the second button. But the second button makes it so that the person who's now guaranteed to be created after the press of the first button, now instead of living 60 happy years, now they live 90 happy years. So it provides a vastly greater benefit to the existing person. Well, this second button seems worth pressing, right? The second button, it makes it so that an existing person doesn't get a benefit, to provide a vastly greater benefit to someone who you've created. It seems like, if anything, you have especially strong obligations to people you've created. But even if you don't have especially strong obligations to people you've created, you at least have some obligations to those you've created. And so it's better to press this second button. But now look at what happens if you press both buttons. If you press both buttons, then you just create a happy person. And so here's a very plausible principle. Suppose you ought to press two buttons that together have some effect. Well, if there's a single button you could press that would have the same effect, then you ought to press that button. Like if you ought to do bop bop to produce an effect, then you ought to press a single button that just has the effect of pressing down the two buttons. Right? So if that's right, then you have a reason, you ought to press a button that simply creates a happy person. So that would be the argument for the asymmetry. Now, there are some steps in this that are a little bit controversial, but I think most ones that are controversial are just not needed. So the one that's most controversial is the last one about sequences of actions, where if you ought to take a sequence of actions that does X, then you ought to take a single action that does X. And I find this to be very intuitive, and I think it's very hard to deny, because if you deny it, then you end up getting the result that you ought to press a single button, then you ought to press two buttons where you press the first and the second and it has some effect. But if there's a third button that it only has the effect of pressing down the other two buttons, then you shouldn't press down that one, which seems very unintuitive. It seems like whether you're taking some action, it doesn't matter if it involves like moving your fingers twice or moving your fingers once. But even if you grant this is not actually enough to get out of the argument, given that the procreation asymmetry, it's not just deontic. It doesn't just say that it's good that you don't have a reason to create a happy person. It says it's not a good thing when a happy person comes to exist. Note that if you only affirm the deontic asymmetry, then you get a very implausible judgment, because so long as it's a good thing when a happy person comes to exist, then it seems like you have at least some reason to create a happy person. So for that reason, oh wait, it seems my mic is not working. Wait, let me switch it up. Yeah, my mic, it seems to do that a lot. Let's see, can you all still hear me? Okay. Hopefully it should be better now. Okay, so yeah. Hello, Tom. Let me finish the explanation, and then I'll chat with you in a minute. Yeah. So the idea is that so long as we think that each of the buttons being pressed is a good thing, then you get the result that it's good. Like consider the following three worlds. In world 1, none of the buttons are pressed. In world 2, just the first button is pressed. And in world 3, both buttons are pressed. Well, world 1 is worse than world 2. World 2 is worse than world 3. So by transitivity, world 3 is better than world 1. So what this would mean is a world with an extra happy person is a better world than a world missing a happy person. So thus, it's good to create a happy person. So that would be one of my arguments for the asymmetry. There are various others. Elliot Thornley has a paper where he gives some arguments for it that I think are very convincing. But yeah, anyways, Tom, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, doing well.
All right. So I did not expect myself to pop up on the screen and everything like that. But anyway, might as well while I'm here. Let's see. So what do you think is the difference between, like, what are the main differences between like the psychophysical argument and like other arguments from consciousness that, you know, maybe like Swinburne or somebody else would talk about?
Yeah, good question. So I think there are different arguments from consciousness. One of the kinds is people simply argue that the existence of consciousness is evidence for theism. That's not what the psychophysical harmony argument is about. It doesn't talk about the fact that consciousness exists. It talks about very specific facts about consciousness. So the fact that the consciousness ends up producing this harmonious pairing between the mental and the physical. Now, Swinburne's argument, if I understand it correctly, is he says the psychophysical laws would have to be very complicated. And so if you have them be brutally existent on naturalism, then naturalism ends up being not at all parsimonious. But theism ends up being able to reduce them to the actions of a perfect being. So as a result, you get so that's Swinburne's argument. I guess I don't really I sort of think that's probably right, but it's harder to show like what the ultimate complexity of the psychophysical laws are. So I think the psychophysical harmony argument is a more convincing argument, and it doesn't require assuming dualism. So that's another draw of it. So I guess those would be some differences.
Gotcha. Thanks. That's all. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. All right, let's see. What else should I rant about? I had another thing that I was gonna, I mean, not really rant, but that you know, soliloquize about. There was something else I was gonna rant about, but I just went on this long spiel about how it wasn't a rant, and then 2 sentences later I said rant. But so I guess, let's see. Okay, Hayden Dupree asks if I've spent much time thinking about various models of God. I haven't spent that much time thinking about it. I share your not liking classical theism. I think you want a view that's sort of close to classical theism. You want a view on which, for example, God does not have parts, on which God is an altogether simple substance, just for simplicity reasons. But you don't want a view on which God is identical to his attributes. That makes no sense. I mean, first of all, like classical theism, it has all these just, I think, huge problems. One of the problems is, and Joe Schmidt has a paper on this, it's called the aloneness argument. So the idea is, okay, imagine a world where God is alone. It's just God. He chooses not to create anything. The classical theists say, this is a possible world. Okay, but now consider God's knowledge that he's alone. Well, there are now 2 possibilities. Is his knowledge within him, or is it not within him? Insofar as his knowledge is within him, then this inevitably produces the result that so is his knowledge within him or not within him? Well, it can't be anything other than within him, because he's the only thing that exists. So his knowledge must be within him. But for God, on classical theism, everything that's within God is the same as God. So God is the same as his knowledge that he's alone. But his knowledge that he's alone is contingent. And so this would mean that God is contingent. But classical theists don't want to say that. So I find this to be very convincing. I also find the transitivity worries, where if you say that God is identical to his power or his goodness, then his goodness is identical to his power. And that just seems like very hard to make sense of. It seems like, no, just they're obviously different things. I also think classical theism struggles with, like, it's just very hard to make sense of the notion that a thing is identical to an act of the thing or an attribute of the thing. So yeah. Okay, Vignu Prakash asks, dude, I want to ask you something. Well, I want to answer something. What about modal realism with uniformity as a fundamental principle? That way we don't undermine induction, an anthropic principle can be an anthropic argument can be countered. So I guess I would need to know more about exactly what the proposal is. If the idea is that, so modal realism, the idea is every possible world exists. So it would seem that this would result in like if every possible world exists, then intuitively it seems like you would just get every world that is disharmonious, or every world that you'd get all these chaotic worlds, and so then you'd have no trust that you're in a non-chaotic world. Now, I guess maybe the proposal is something like, well, God only creates all of the sort of orderly world, like all the worlds that have orderly, uniform laws. Those are the ones that exist. Maybe that would be the proposal. But there, you still get the same worry, because even if you only create worlds that are orderly, well, then you'd still get Aleph null, or you'd still get whatever the cardinality is of the number of people that exist. You'd still get that many people who are deceived. And so long as you have that many people that you're deceived, your credence in you being not deceived is undefined. Now, this would seem like it applies to theism as well. On theism, presumably, there will be the same cardinality of people who are deceived as not deceived. But theism has a way out, because for theism, for every particular person, God will give them the life that's ideal for their flourishing. And for any particular person, it's unlikely that the life that's ideal for your flourishing is a life where you're massively deceived. So on theism, it's unlikely that you're deceived. In contrast, on any kind of naturalism, because there's no process that applies to every person that makes them probably not deceived, then you get almost a guarantee of deception. This, by the way, applies, I think, even if just the universe is infinite in size. I think you get the result that because there are Aleph null people who are deceived and not deceived all the time, there are Aleph null schizophrenics, for example, that you get a credence of undefined in you being massively deceived. So, like, here's an analogy. Suppose you're in Hilbert's Hotel and you roll a 6-sided die. Your credence in the die coming up 1 through 5 should be 5/6, even though there are the same number of people who get 1 through 5 or as who get 6. In both cases, it's Aleph null. And in fact, if you wanted to, you could make every room in Hilbert's Hotel be filled with 1,000 people who get 6 and only one person who gets 1 through 5. Or the other way around, you could have them all have 1,000 people at 1 through 5. You could pair them however you want. This is just a fact about infinity. But the reason why you should think that you're probably not deceived isn't that most people are not deceived. The same number of people, same cardinality of people are deceived and not deceived. The reason is you know that you have some specific property, namely that you rolled the die, that makes it so that the odds are only 1 in 6 that you're deceived. In a similar way, on theism, you know that you have some particular property, namely that you were created in the world's ideal for your flourishing. That makes it unlikely that you're massively deceived. So for this reason, I think theism is basically the only view that can get enough people without being extremely gerrymandered that doesn't bring about skepticism. Okay, Hayden, you say, and timelessness has a whole host of problems too. Yeah, I guess I'm less certain about timelessness. The view I lean towards is I think God's existence is analogous to the existence of the numbers, where think about the mathematical truths. Well, the mathematical truths, the mathematical facts, they sort of exist at every moment in time, but they also exist timelessly, where their existence just is wholly independent of the sort of space-time configuration. I think probably God is the same. But I also don't know. I'm not unsympathetic. I find all the views, I don't think there are knockdown arguments against any of the views. I find it weird to make sense of how a being timelessly creates. So for that reason, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the view that lots of people had. But yeah. Okay. Vigner Prakash. You ask, you said somewhere in your blog that SIA can get you out faux brain in a vat scenarios. I see that stuff. Can you explain it to me like I'm 6? Okay, right. So the idea is it doesn't get you out of all brain in a vat scenarios, but it at least makes the brain in a vat argument much less convincing. So suppose that you are a brain. So consider the simple brain in a vat theory, where there's just one guy in one vat, one brain in one vat. Well, SIA says a theory that says there are more people is more likely. A theory that says there are 10 times as many people that you might presently be is 10 times likelier. A theory that says that there are 100 times as many people that you might presently be is 100 times likelier. But on the theory that the universe is very large, on that theory, yeah, on that theory, you would just expect for there to be the creation of all possible people. So, or sorry, on that theory, like, so insofar as we adopt SIA, sorry, I sometimes trail off mid-sentence and then I say something that's just totally unrelated to what I was talking about. Not good. But the mic froze that again. Wait, okay, I'm gonna fix it again. I don't know why my mic freaking does this, but yeah, but so I mean, the short answer is theism favors a theory on which, sorry, SIA favors a theory on which there are more people. The brain of that theory naturally says there's only one person, and so as a result, it'll be lowered in probability. Thomas Diaz asks, what do I think about the evolutionary argument against naturalism? So I think it's like, I've never really like gotten it. I think it probably doesn't work, but I have a friend who's very insistent that it works, and he has some stuff that I went way over my head. But I'll just give my understanding of whether it works, which is it seems like it doesn't. The reason is that I think there's a plausible evolutionary story of why it's beneficial to have true beliefs. So if you have a creature that is constantly deceived about everything, if you're deceived about whether there's a lion in the bush, that'll be quite detrimental to your survival. So for that reason, I think it's good. Hayden, sorry that I left you triggered. To be clear, I don't have a strong view. I haven't thought very much about timelessness. But yeah, I like the Swinburne view. Swinburne, smart guy. He might be right there. But yeah, anyways, okay. Patrick asks, has the anthropic argument been made in any good journals? What do you think is the weakest part of the argument? Or what do I think the most knowledgeable atheist philosophers would say in response? Okay, so that's a good question. It has not been made in any journals. It so far has not been made in any journals. Amos and we sent it to a few journals and it's gotten rejected. But I mean, it's gotten like close to being accepted. Like there have been individual reviewers who accepted it. I think the problem with writing a paper about it is if you write a paper that includes both the case for SIA and you try to respond to objections, then the paper's too long. So the way we've written the paper is just as a conditional claim that if you grant SIA, then you should accept theism, or at least you get good evidence for theism. But now if you phrase the argument that way, then the argument ends up being like, it's unclear. The paper then seems a lot less interesting or ambitious. Like, okay, sure, I guess if you accept this view, that's really weird, then you get theism. It's only when you see the really strong case for SIA that it becomes an interesting argument. So what do I think is the weakest part of the argument? That's a good question. I don't really think there are weak parts of the argument. I guess the part that I think is the most vulnerable to criticism is just SIA. At the very least, I think if you wanted to reject the argument, if you were a competent theistic philosopher, what you'd probably say is SIA is false. This is what most of the philosophers who I present this to, they say, yeah, this might work if SIA is true, but like I didn't accept SIA. I don't like know anything about anthropics. Anthropics is a weird field. I guess so that would be the part that I think is most vulnerable. But I think there are really strong arguments for SIA. So I don't know. Maybe the most vulnerable is like stuff about infinity. Like maybe the biggest criticism that I think is like the most reasonable is something like just anthropics is really weird, especially when you get to infinity. So you shouldn't place that many eggs in the basket of an infinite anthropic argument. I guess I think that it's pretty intuitive how SIA, like there are some cases where infinite anthropics is weird, but in this case, it's not that weird. Just like SIA, once you think SIA is right, the implication that think there are a bunch of people is pretty straightforward. And there are arguments for it for sure. So there, I think there's a strong argument. So by the way, I had a brief conversation with Graham Oppie about it. He was doing like a call-in thing on Discord. And so I talked with him briefly. Hey, Vignu. And he said that he thinks the argument goes through if you accept SIA, but he doesn't accept SIA. But he hadn't seen it. It didn't seem like he had thought very much about anthropics before. Hello, Vignu. You're currently muted. Joe, to answer your question, I guess I'll answer other questions if people have them. Like if other people have specific questions, I suppose I'm happy to answer those. But I mean, primarily the things I'm talking about are the things in the title. But yeah, I guess I'll answer whatever questions you all have. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. What other rants do I have? Big news back. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So that objection, I didn't get a clear picture about that. Just now I asked that, like, can I adopt modal realism with uniformity as a fundamental principle? So every world will be uniform somehow, and so that way I can preserve induction somehow. So I am thinking on that line. So what do you think?
Okay, so the idea there, first of all, I mean, this wouldn't be modal realism. And in fact, I think it would have a very low prior because it would just be an arbitrary, like imagine, here's a theory you might have. Modal realism, but every world is painted green. This theory seems to be a very bad theory because it's just like, it's very arbitrary. Why this arbitrary restriction on the possible worlds? So similarly, if you have a view that's like modal realism, but you have an arbitrary restriction on the possible worlds, then it seems like a very unmotivated and implausible theory. So that's the first thing I would say, that I think it is low prior. The second thing is, I don't think that the theory is, even if you posit that the world is uniform, I mean, I guess I'd have to know a little bit about what the sense in which it's uniform. If the idea is just the physical laws work the same way throughout the entire universe, even if it's uniform in that respect, well, there's still going to be a lot of Boltzmann brains that just arise by chance. There's still going to be infinite of those. So then you end up getting, for exactly the same reason, you end up getting undefined credence in your cognitive faculties being reliable, because there are all these Boltzmann brains that have your exact same experiences, but that are massively deceived.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about some kind of, I'm not sure what kind of uniformity I'm thinking about, but just I need to preserve some, I need to preserve induction some way. That's what I'm thinking about. So
yeah, the worry is that if you have an infinite universe, it's really hard to preserve induction. It's like shockingly difficult. And the reason is that if you have an infinite universe, then so long as the universe, even if, like, let's just suppose you had a world that's exactly like ours, where, you have galaxies and stars and so on, and they just stretch out forever. Okay, you might think, okay, that seems like it preserves induction. It actually, I don't think it does. And the reason it doesn't preserve induction is that there are Aleph null people who are deceived, just as there are Aleph null people who are not deceived. And so insofar as there are Aleph null people who are both deceived and not deceived, your credence in you being deceived should be undefined, right? On what basis do you think you're likelier to be one of the not deceived people than the deceived people? Now, as I explained, theism has a way out, because it says for every particular person, they're in a state, namely God putting them in a situation ideal for their flourishing, that makes it unlikely that they're deceived. But if you don't know that, if you just have, people spread throughout the universe, well, there are infinite deceived and infinite non-deceived ones, and there's no process that applies to every person that makes them mostly not deceived. And so as a result, you just get a high credence in you being deceived.
So I'm not sure about the Boltzmann brain objection, but I think the arbitrariness, like you are also committed to some kind of uniformity, right? Either it is like laws without limit. Like I've seen you arguing in some of your posts that either God being with unlimited power or unlimited goodness is more probable, because a law without like any arbitrary limit is more probable. So I think that uniformity or coherence, as Draper calls it, is somehow intrinsically more probable. I think it's similar to your laws without arbitrary limits. So that way, uniformity will be somehow more fundamentally intrinsically probable. So that's why I am so attracted to uniformity.
Yeah. Well, so as I was explaining, I think even if you have this, you end up getting, it undermines induction. But I mean, in terms of the worry about priors, so what makes a theory simple is if you can give the characterization of everything what makes a theory have a high prior is something like, I mean, it's a combination of things, but two of the things that are important are, first, if you can give a simple characterization while invoking only fundamental entities of everything that's going on at the fundamental level. So with theism, you can't. You say there's limitless consciousness. you take a fundamental thing, consciousness, and you impose no limits on it. Insofar as the consciousness isn't limited in any respect, it can do anything. It can bring any fact to mind, so it knows everything. And so for that reason, theism is really simple. And then it's also elegant in that there aren't sort of arbitrary, carve-outs. Now, while your view, it may seem like there aren't arbitrary cutouts because you make it so that the view is you get only the uniform ones. Well, in order to get the uniform ones, you have to arbitrarily restrict the share of possible worlds that there are. So modal realism seems like a simple theory because you just say every possible world exists. Well, with this theory, you have to say every possible world exists except these kinds of worlds. And these kinds of worlds can be given a completely adequate description, right? So you have to specify exactly. You have to be. It has to be much higher. Now, the other worry is that I actually don't think there's a non-arbitrary way of specifying what it is for a world to be uniform. Where the idea is, so imagine that we have. So for any law that is non-uniform, it can be phrased as uniform law, right? So for example, consider the law that basically the world that you would get if you have laws exactly like ours, except after 13.8 billion years, the universe is replaced by a duck. Well, this is a uniform law. Throughout the entire universe, it checks, at every time it checks to see if 13.8 billion years have passed. If they haven't, it does nothing. If they have, it turns the universe into a duck. These are fully uniform laws. They apply consistently throughout the universe. And so it's, I don't think there's like an in-principle way of ruling out its uniformity. And so for that reason, I think there's no way.
I think
non-uniform.
Sorry, I think you're going into some kind of good man's paradox. So the group problem. So I'm not like positing like laws. I'm kind of Humean, but I don't think it does matter. When I'm saying something uniform is intrinsically more probable, what I meant is how much uniformity it posits to the universe. Can I ask you something? Are you familiar with Draper's work about Sinburn? I think the book was edited by Bergman. Are you familiar with that work? Where Richard Swinburne has this criteria of simplicity to how to assess the prior probability. So he has 5 criteria, 5 facets of simplicity. Sorry, 5 facets of prior probability. Like simplicity, it should be uniform, it should be using simple language, it should be positing less entities, less kind of entity, something like that. And Draper counters this, he objects Swinburne by combining it to a single criteria called coherence. So he says that if something is coherent or more uniform, it can include all these criteria. It can include all Swinburne's 5 facets. So it is more fundamental principle when assessing prior probability. So I'm more convinced with Draper's work. So why it is important here? Like when it comes to modal realism, even if you take all the possible worlds, if uniformity is more fundamental when assessing intrinsic probability, we can confidently say that all the possible worlds are somehow uniform. Like I like to repeat that I don't know how to assess the Boltzmann right problem because I don't know, I don't have that expertise in physics, so I don't know. I don't even know what the Boltzmann problem clearly is.
Problem that I was describing, it doesn't depend on any specific facts about physics. The point is just you'll sometimes get Boltzmann brains in a universe, right? Like sometimes stuff, matter drifting together in particular ways will get Boltzmann brains by chance. But if the universe is infinite, then you'll have infinite Boltzmann brains. And insofar as you can pair them one-to-one, the Boltzmann brains and the non-Boltzmann brains, which is true if they're the same cardinality, then inevitably you don't get, there's no coherent sense in which there are more Boltzmann brains than...
Sorry, could you explain what a Boltzmann brain is?
What, sorry?
What a Boltzmann brain is, according to my best understanding... okay, you go on.
Yeah. So Boltzmann brain, it's just a brain that randomly sort of fizzes into existence in the recesses of outer space. That it's not where like its beliefs, it'll be created with fake memories, with fake experiences, and so on. So like just if a brain randomly forms in outer space by chance for a few seconds, that's a Boltzmann brain.
Okay. So you're saying that if there is like so many possible worlds, we could be a Boltzmann brain.
The point is, if there are infinite worlds that exist, then the cardinality of the number of Boltzmann brains is going to be the same as the cardinality of the number of non-Boltzmann brains. right? Because even if you have one Boltzmann brane every 10 quadrillion galaxies, if the world is infinite, then you get Aleph null Boltzmann branes and Aleph null people, and so then your credence in you being a Boltzmann brane ends up being undefined.
Okay, so no, I will look into Boltzmann brain further. So I will come again in your stream to talk about the Boltzmann brain. So I'd like to ask you something else about fine tuning.
Sure.
Yeah. So actually, the same objection that I would like to ask, that if I take something like the fundamental reality is physical, and it is probable that something physical will only arise from the fundamental reality. So when it comes to theism only predicts conscious agents, right? It doesn't predict physical life. So I'm imagining that even if the laws were different, suppose that the gravitational constant was somewhat like different and the universe collapses, and imagine a soul forms, and many soul forms, and they express love, and they actualizes all the values, all the goods. So this is probable. I mean, this is possible under theism, but according to my physicalism, this is not possible. So when doing the probability assessment, I have an upper hand, right? When I take such a kind of physicalism.
Yeah, I don't think that's right, because okay, two things. The first one is that if you have a physicalist theory, and what you define as part of physicalism or naturalism or something is the supposition that there's a physical world, well, then it'll predict that there's a physical world with higher probability than theism. But just conditional on atheism, I think the highest probability scenario is that there's nothing at all, right? So I don't think you would expect a physical scenario, and all the sort of brain world with just a few conscious beings with just like a few souls that are possible on theism are also going to be possible on atheism. So that would be the first thing I would say, that I don't think you get an advantage in predicting the physical world. The second one is that even if you get some advantage in predicting the mere existence of a physical world, where like even if you get a world that collapses or something, God could miraculously make it. I think all that you need is, given that the odds of fine tuning are so low on atheism, all that you need is that the odds are not insignificant of you getting embodied conscious agents. All that you need is that agents that are physically constituted, the odds of that are not too low on theism. Now, insofar as there's no a priori reason to privilege a disembodied world to an embodied world, and that all the worlds where you don't have finely tuned worlds are worlds where God basically makes sort of like, artificially makes there be life, where there wouldn't naturally be life, where there wouldn't naturally be any sets of any complex structures, where he does huge amounts of miracles, then I think you should basically adopt at least something like a principle of indifference between where you should your credence in conditional on theism, your credence in the world being very large. Sorry, conditional on theism, your credence in the world being having the laws of physics that naturally give rise to complex structures should be, not like 0, but not that low, maybe like around 0.5. But then the odds of getting the cosmological constant that you do on theism is just so much higher than on naturalism, because it's so low on naturalism that you get massive evidence. The other thing is, I think while theism and naturalism, that there's a physical world at all, maybe that favors theism and naturalism by a little bit if you build that into naturalism. But once you take into account the full range of data, which is that there's a natural world and it produces anything interesting, even barring fine tuning, even just like that you don't get completely random chaos from the law structure alone, that'll massively favor theism. If you think about the overwhelming majority of possible laws, they would either produce completely random chaos or produce just nothing interesting, like stuff just moving in a circle. So given that, I think it's highly unlikely. I think if you take the facts one by one, where you say, first, there are laws that are capable of giving rise to interesting structures, that's evidence for naturalism. And then you say, and given that there are laws like this, there are finely tuned constants that happen to be such that they pair with the laws to give rise to interesting structures. Well, that's even more evidence for theism. So I think overall theism will get a big boost. Hi, Christian Nexus. By the way, I do want to at some point answer Thomas Dias's question about why the multiverse solution to fine-tuning fails, because I think it's an interesting subject. But yeah, go ahead, Christian.
Hello. Just want to play a devil's advocate. So you said that the probability of getting randomness is higher than having like some type of a law, right? Or sorry, probability of getting random laws or a random universe is higher than the probability of having a regular universe. Is that right?
So what I said was, you get a low probability of conditional on naturalism. You get a very low probability of there being a world that produces anything interesting at all, right? So what you would expect. So there are two ways of divvying up the priors. There are more than just these, but they'll fall into basically one of these patterns. One of the ways is you say there's a really major bias in favor of thinking that there are simpler laws. If you say there's a major bias in favor of thinking that there are simpler laws, then almost certainly you get one of the really simple laws. So almost certainly you get just particles, say, moving in a circle, or like moving in a straight line, or just something very boring, not at all interesting, no interesting structures rise, nothing of value ever arises. So that's the most likely scenario if simpler laws are more likely. If simpler laws are not more likely, then almost certainly you get really, really complicated laws, and most really, really complicated laws just produce random chaos. So no matter how you divvy up the priors, you get a very high probability of either just like stuff that's too simple to produce anything interesting, or stuff that's too complicated to produce anything interesting. It's very surprising that we hit the sweet spot where we got a world that was complicated enough to produce interesting structures, but simple enough to not evolve to random chaos.
And why do you say complicated laws produce randomness?
So the idea is consider for every orderly law, there are a bunch of chaotic laws. So for example, suppose that you consider our law where, I don't know our exact laws of physics, but there things follow some orderly laws. There are infinite permutations of this that produce random chaos. So here's another law. They follow this law up until 5 seconds after the Big Bang, and then everything's replaced by a duck or a unicorn or a fish. There are infinite permutations of this. Or, then they follow some totally different set of laws, and then they follow a different set of different laws. And then they, half of the universe just gets destroyed. Like there are just all these permutations of ways that the world could be where it wouldn't produce where it would produce random chaos. So chaos dominates order.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but there are also an infinite amount of simple laws. So, there are infinite amount of ways that the universe could have been conditional on naturalism, in which there could have been simple laws. So then the ratio of simple to complex laws is like infinite over infinite. So you can't really make a determination about the probability of getting randomness compared to some sort of law-like universe.
Yeah, so that's true. It's a hard problem to figure out exactly how you're supposed to make the infinite comparisons, but it's always hard to make infinite comparisons like this. So like here's an analogy. Suppose that at the Big Bang, the world spelled out made by God. I think this would be really good evidence for the existence of God. But now you could say, look, there are infinite ways the world might spell it made by God, and infinite ways the world wouldn't spell it made by God. It's not obvious which one's larger. It's same cardinality. And so, so we get undefined credences. Like, I don't know exactly like how to do the math, but I'm very confident that's wrong. I'm very confident that this is wrong for the same reason, which is that for every world where that's mostly orderly, you could pair it with a bunch of mostly chaotic worlds. Now maybe you'll get undefined credence in order on atheism, but that's also a really bad result, right? If you think
are you saying for every world which is orderly, there are an infinite amount of worlds which are disorderly, as in
yes.
They follow the same pattern up to some arbitrary point x, arbitrary time point t,
yes,
and then they diverge?
Yeah, consider any world that's orderly. Here's another possible world. It's orderly up until some time t, and then it becomes replaced by just a single particle, or 2 particles, or 3 particles, ... for any number of particles. And in fact, for any real number of particles, because you could have it be replaced by like a field with some value across all the real numbers, or you could have it be replaced by just any possible world. So it seems for anyone that's orderly, there are just infinite ones that are disorderly.
Oh, I get it. So conditional on naturalism, the probability of getting any sort of order is it's almost infinitely low. And then why do you say the probability of getting interesting patterns is very low on conditional on naturalism?
So the idea is, if we think about the simplest laws don't produce anything interesting. So like, for example, just think about any of the simplest ways the world could be. Well, here's a really simple way. You have stuff and it doesn't do anything. That's very simple. Or here's another way. You have stuff, but it just moves in a line. This is very simple. Or it just moves, according to some extremely basic mathematical pattern. Maybe it moves in a circle. Maybe it moves in a square pattern. Maybe it, keeps moving in a line, and then if it hits each other, it bounces off in some direction. There are an infinite number of shapes that all the particles could move in. Maybe they just after 1 second, they all fuse together. Maybe after 1 second, just every particle disappears. There are all these ways that that you could have a simple world. In contrast, it's much harder to get a world that produces anything interesting.
Okay.
And this is a fairly well vindicated result. So, for example, John Conway had his game of life, where he has little dots and you place them down, and then you click start, and then the dots move around according to some pattern of laws. It produces this interesting and cool pattern of dots moving around. But John Conway had to work really hard to find a set of laws that would make dots move around in an interesting way. The overwhelming majority of ways that he tried to set it up, it just didn't produce anything interesting. So I mean, the kind of
here's a simple law. Here's one simple law. Things just attract. Things just attract, and then by virtue of attracting, things form complex patterns, and then from complex patterns, life emerges. Isn't that sort of a simple law that predicts
if
life?
you just have things attract, you won't get any complex pattern. Like if you just have the laws, everything attracts, then you just get everything smushed together.
All right. So suppose it's like everything just attracts up to some point, and then a stronger force takes over, which is repulsion.
Okay, well then it seems like you would get particles just like moving in and out. Like
yeah, right.
You would get particles close and then they move away, and then they get close and then they move away. That won't give rise to life. That won't give rise to anything interesting.
Okay.
Now you can add more laws, right? So you could say, oh, you get this other law, and then it gives rise to complicated structures. And you can, if you add a few more laws, then eventually, I mean, it's hard to figure out from the armchair exactly how you get life, but eventually you could get a series of laws that eventually gets life. But the point is, you have to add quite a few laws, and you have to have it be very arbitrary and gerrymandered in order to get life.
Okay, I get it. Now, next objection I have is, don't you have to appeal to a very specific form of theism in order to make predictions? And I can just appeal to a very specific form of naturalism. And a very specific form of naturalism makes equal predictions, makes identical predictions to the specific form of theism that you're appealing to.
Yeah, so I addressed this at the beginning of the stream, but I'm happy to.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries. I mean, I think there were literally 0 people watching as I was explaining it, so might be worth explaining again. Right, so this is the famous Stalking horse objection. So it's true that if you build into your naturalistic hypothesis, if you build in some extra supposition that the thing that predicts fine tuning, then you also get predicting fine tuning. But this is just true of any data point, right? So suppose you run the problem of evil. I can only say, suppose I build into my theistic hypothesis, I build in a supposition that God will create evil. No, but theories predict evil, right? Yes, you can always do that, but insofar as this doesn't tell you much about whether it's a successful argument, insofar as the odds of this extra supposition are very low conditional on naturalism, then it's going to be evidence against naturalism. Now, to be clear, it's not like we just like built in this extra supposition just to explain the data. Theists have always thought that there's a perfect being. This is what theism is, right? So they're not building in some extra supposition. They're building in something that already follows from their pre-existing commitments. In contrast, the naturalist has to build in something extra in order to explain the data. And so what this means is maybe if you're a naturalist, depending on what your priors are, maybe the fine-tuning argument won't convince you because you'll think the prior probability of there being a perfect being is so low that it's outweighed by the prior probability of this very, very specific segment of naturalist probability space. But now,
could you explain your hypothesis one more time?
Sorry. Let me just briefly finish the point. But now, if you have a person who's on the fence, like they hadn't heard about fine-tuning at all, and they were on the fence between theism and naturalism, I claim the fine-tuning argument ought to convince them of theism because it raised the probability of theism. And this doesn't affect whether that's true, whether it's a good argument in the sense that it ought to convince an agnostic, because the agnostic, yes, you can build into your theory to explain it, but insofar as it falls out of the theist's existing commitments, and for the naturalist, you have to add in some extra implausible supposition, then it's going to be evidence for theism. The other point is just that I think the theistic hypothesis that predicts the data, at least with decent odds, is very simple, where you just say there's limitless consciousness. In contrast, for naturalism to predict the data, you need to add in some very, very specific and sort of arbitrary thing that ends up being implausible.
I have 2 objections here.
Let me just finish the sentence after this one.
Oh yeah, sorry.
It's very low probability on naturalism because for every stalking horse explanation that predicts finely tuned constants, there's a stalking horse explanation that predicts finely not tuned constants for each of the finely tuned constants. So the odds of finely tuned constants are very low.
Okay, I have 2 objections or questions here. The first one is, how does God desiring to produce life fall out of generic theism. You said something like, "Oh, well, generic theism sort of predicts it because the hypothesis he would desire life." I don't think you said that verbatim, but you said something like that. Just falls out of theism. How does it fall out of generic theism? And then the second question is, why would you say that omnipotence, or sorry, unlimited power is simple? I can just say it's a very complex property.
Yeah, so I'll answer the first one first. So the reason is it's not so insofar as a being is perfect, it wants to create good stuff. Now, the best kind of thing is conscious agents, right? A world, if you haven't had an empty world that was just very beautiful, that would be okay, but like it wouldn't be great. It wouldn't have very much value. And so for this reason, I think God is likely to create conscious agents. And therefore, as God is likely to create conscious agents, he has to have some way of creating conscious agents. Now, maybe he'd make disembodied agents. So the odds of conscious agents on theism are not like 1, but he's also decently likely to make embodied agents out of a physical world. And so the odds of that are maybe going to be 0.5. And then the odds are so low on naturalism that it's much higher probability on theism.
Oh, yeah. Understand. But I'm asking about generic theism. I'm not asking about perfect being theism. So generic theism is just like a mind created universe or some very powerful entity created universe. Do you think?
I guess normally when people in philosophy of religion use the word theism, they mean the supposition that there's a perfect being. That's how it's often used in philosophy of religion. And this is what I'm intending to argue for. So what I'm saying is, I think the supposition that it's a perfect being, this goes up in probability as a result of theism. Now, in terms of whether or not, so I think overall theism, like as you're using it, just the supposition that a mind created the universe, I think that also goes up in probability, because while it's not guaranteed that a mind would want to create life, it's at least not that unlikely. Life is one of the things that's valuable. And so it's not like super unlikely that a being would want to, like, just if we imagine a simulator, like the simulator is light, maybe they're not guaranteed to make a finely tuned constant, but at least it's not terribly unlikely. Maybe like odds are 10%. And the odds are so low on naturalism that it'll be evidence for theism. And I also think that a large portion of the theism as you are using in probability space, that is the supposition that the world was created by a being, I think most of that probability space is taken up by a perfect being because it has the highest prior. And so insofar as that's where most of the probability space lies, then you don't have to add any extra stipulations because that's already where most of the theistic probability mass lies. Now, to answer your second question about why think that a being of unlimited power is simple. Well, first of all, so I wasn't saying that it's simple on account of having unlimited power. What I was saying was it's simple on account of having one core property, which is being a limitless mind, a limitless consciousness. If you have a limitless consciousness, then having a will, it will, given that a limitless consciousness has will, its will be perfectly efficacious. If there's something it can't do, there's a limit on the consciousness. And so insofar as you take one of the fundamental things, consciousness, and you place no limits on it, that's a very simple theory. It's very elegant. You can specify it in a sentence, limitless consciousness, and it predicts the data really well. So for that reason, I think it's a pretty good theory. It's for the same reason that the theory that space is infinite is better than the theory that space is any particular finite length. And I think if you have a limited deity, then it just pushes the problem back a level, because then you need fine tuning in order to set the degree of its power to be what it is. Most of the powers, like why does the deity happen to have a set of powers and desires that it does to produce an interesting universe when it could have any set of powers and desires? And so then it just pushes fine tuning back a level, unless you have a being where you take a fundamental property and instantiate it wholly without limit, like you do with God in the case of being a mind or a consciousness without limit.
Okay, so one last objection I want to run by you. How would you respond to people who say that perfect efficacy of will is not a simple property because you can think of two agents. One agent has desires to permanently destroy something. The other agent desires to permanently create something. Having perfect efficacy of will doesn't really pick out one agent. It might refer to either one of these agents. And I can just multiply this scenario infinitely. I can come up with like an almost infinite amount of agents who would fall under this rubric or under this designation of having perfect efficacy of will. But it doesn't really pick out any particular agent in this set.
Well, so I guess I don't think you couldn't have multiple agents with perfectly efficacious will, because then what happens if they disagree? At least you can't have agents that are such that they possibly disagree and have perfectly efficacious will.
No, but I'm just talking about one agent. Suppose it's like one agent desires to both permanently create and permanently destroy something. Okay, in this case, obviously that's impossible. So the only type of agents which are possible is either one which permanently creates or permanently destroys. But under this definition, both would have perfect efficacy of will. So perfect efficacy of will doesn't really pick out any particular agent. So it becomes now a complex property. It's not a simple property.
I don't think that's true. I don't think an agent, insofar as it has the sort of will that's efficacious, I don't think it can simultaneously will like two contradictory states. Like imagine you have an agent who simultaneously wills to move their arm left and right at the same time. You can't do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the agent with perfect efficacy of will is either gonna have the ability to permanently create, or it's gonna have the ability to permanently destroy something, right?
Well, no, it has the ability to permanently either create or destroy. It just can't will both of those at the same time.
Okay, right. So that's the point. So now the term perfect efficacy of will picks out a very complex property. In fact, it picks out a disjunction of properties. It picks out something like a perfect efficacy, a being with a perfect efficacy of will has the power to permanently create or permanently destroy a particle, or it has the ability to permanently create
it just has
the
the
world.
ability to, if it wills something for that thing to happen, that's what its power is. Now, I mean, to be clear, I think this power, it reduces to a more fundamental power, which is that it's a limitless mind, or to a more fundamental property. But it just has this one property, which is being a limitless mind. And then if you're a limitless mind, well, you can't will contradictory things. Just like you can't will the movement of your arm left and right at the same time. You can sort of, in some sense, wish that your arm would go left and would go right, but you can't will it in the same sense. And so for that reason...
Okay, but that's just the objection that now perfect efficacy of will becomes a disjunctive property. So it's no longer simple. Because
it's not a disjunctive property. It's not like the property is not like do this unless this happens, and if this happens, do this. It's do what you will. Now, what you will,
but
you can only will one thing once, but they do what they will.
Well, it does become a disjunctive property because it says, well, you can permanently create unless you wish to permanently destroy something, or you can permanently create a particle unless you permanently wish to destroy it.
The essential property is not about creation or destruction. The essential property is about will. The property is they can do what they will. Now, they can't will two different contradictory things, right? Just like you can't will to move your arm left and right at the same time. And so it has one will, and its will is followed. This is a very simple property.
What if it wills to permanently create something, and then at some later time, it decides to permanently destroy it?
So there was a question about whether it can bind its future self, whether it can will that the thing has the property that I think it probably can't, right? Because I think that I think that probably willing something that necessarily permanently has some property is probably impossible for God, because there just isn't a thing that necessarily, like, suppose God wills, there's a permanent bench or something that will never go away. Even if he wills it to go away, I don't think there is any possible bench that is such that it would not go away if he wills it to go away. So I don't think it's a possible bench. And so for that reason, it's not a limit on his power because it's not possible.
Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming on. Hello, Reflective Journey. Though I guess, but before I talk to you, Reflective Journey, I do want to answer Thomas Diaz's question about the multiverse, because I think this is a very interesting one, and I think it's the best. If you're an atheist, I think the best way to go is to buy the multiverse explanation. By the way, I don't know why I keep being covered by darkness. This is the thing my camera just does. It just turns dark. Sometimes it goes purple. It's very strange. I don't know why it does that. But okay, so I guess I have a few objections to the multiverse. The most important point, and the thing that frames everything, is even if the multiverse can explain fine-tuning, it's still likelier conditional on theism than on naturalism. Like, you can always come up with an explanation, but insofar as the explanation isn't plausible, conditional on your theory, then there'll be evidence against it. Like, so insofar as the fine-tuning argument is just, we have finely tuned constants. The odds of finely tuned constants are higher on theism than on naturalism, in that they're decently high on theism and low on naturalism. A multiverse won't affect that argument, because unless you think that the odds of a multiverse are very high on naturalism, which I don't see a reason to think, and for reasons I'll describe, I think the odds of a multiverse are pretty low on naturalism. So that's the most important point. Just like, even if the multiverse can explain things, insofar as it's low conditional on theism, on naturalism rather, then it doesn't adequately, it doesn't affect the fine-tuning argument. Okay, but now I think it has 5 other problems. The first one is, if we think about the conceptual fine-tuning point, so there are different kinds of fine-tuning. One of them is the point from physics, that the laws of physics fall in this narrow range where they give rise to complex structures. But then there's just also this more basic conceptual point, which is that just interesting things arise, and the odds of interesting things arising is higher on theism than on naturalism. Now, insofar as we're going with that essential point, that you get interesting stuff, that's likelier on theism than on naturalism, well, the multiverse just is a way for interesting things to arise. The multiverse is an example of an interesting thing that arises, namely a generator that generates a bunch of universes that vary the laws, constants, and initial conditions. But it's much likelier that rather than getting a multiverse, rather than getting that particular thing that gives rise to interesting structures, it's much likelier that you would just get something much simpler or much more complicated and chaotic, so that you probably just wouldn't get an interesting multiverse. By the way, I lay out all these arguments I have an article called The Fine-Tuning Argument Simply Works. So I lay out all these out here. Feel free to check it out on my blog. Okay, the second argument against the multiverse is, so Robin Collins has argued that there's a second kind of fine-tuning, which is fine-tuning for discoverability. What he argues is that there are certain values of the masses of various fundamental particles that fall in this narrow range where they're needed for us to do science properly. So if they didn't fall in this narrow range, then, for example, we wouldn't have discovered certain particles. And the particles, they all fall, he made this testable prediction in advance, they all fall in this very narrow range that is ideal for us discovering them. Now, insofar as Robin Collins is right about this, is right about the physics, which he's had other people look at it, it's not totally definitive yet, but there isn't the kind of broad consensus as there is about the other kinds of fine-tuning, but nonetheless it sort of seems like a building consensus is growing. And he's right about this, then theism the multiverse won't explain. It won't explain why there's why there's a fine-tuning for discoverability, because we could have found ourselves in the world where we exist but don't have discoverability, and so then it's improbable that we find ourselves in a world that not only has life but is discoverable. So it doesn't address that second kind of fine-tuning. The third point is, I think, and this is a criticism that's raised a lot in the physics literature, it seems like the multiverse runs the risk of a Boltzmann brain problem, where so you get the Boltzmann brain problem because you get it for a few reasons. The first one is the kind of one way in which you get a bunch of Boltzmann brains is if you have a high entropy universe, then you can get Boltzmann brains, a universe where there's lots of chaotic happenings going on. But you won't get any stable life. At least stable life will be very rare. Yeah, I guess so. If there's a multiverse, then there's a high risk of getting a lot of Boltzmann brains, and then your credence in you having veridical experiences either ends up probably being low or undefined. The other reasons why a multiverse might get you a Boltzmann brain is that a non-finely tuned universe can still get you a Boltzmann brain, just like randomly fizzing into existence, but it won't get you any stable life. And so as a result, because there are so many more non-finely tuned universes than finely tuned universes, then you probably get mostly non-fine tuning. And by the way, the sort of default is high entropy. Our universe is an unusually low entropy state, and that's one of the kinds of fine tuning that people point to. So for those reasons, I think a multiverse leaves high risk of being a Boltzmann brain. Now, this isn't totally decisive. There's disagreement in the physics literature, but it at least seems like a problem. The fourth problem is, in order to get a multiverse, that explains the data, there's not just fine tuning for the constants. There's fine-tuning for the laws, the constants, and the initial conditions. This is something Robin Collins has argued in his piece in the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology. Now, insofar as you need a multiverse that varies the laws, constants, and initial conditions, well, that puts very sharp constraints on the kinds of multiverses that you can have. Like, even it's weird that a multiverse varies the initial conditions. It's weird that it varies the laws, and it's weird that it varies the constant. So it's unlikely that it would vary all of them without getting too many boltzmann brains, and without walls, so solving for discoverability, without making it hopelessly complicated, and thus have a low prior. And so that's a fourth problem. A fifth problem is a multiverse, insofar as the multiverse is infinite. This is just another constraint on a multiverse. Insofar as the multiverse is infinite, then you'll have infinite people who are deceived and not deceived, so it maybe undermines induction. And this is it's a very difficult problem that physicists have spent a lot of time talking about. This is called the measure problem. The sixth and final point is, suppose that the atheist, they can come up with on a multiverse model, suppose that it explains the data. I think even if they do this, they're in a bad spot, because theism gives you a reason to predict a multiverse. Atheism does not. A multiverse is a good thing. It's good to have lots of different kinds of universes. A universe is a good thing. So on theism, we would expect there to be a bunch of different kinds of universes. In contrast, on naturalism, there's no reason to expect a bunch of different kinds of universes. So for that reason, I think best case scenario, the atheist explains fine-tuning by invoking a multiverse, which is itself argument evidence for theism. It's in itself a valuable thing that supports theism. So for those reasons, I think the multiverse is the best atheist response, but it has a problem. Okay, Random Video Blogs asks, do I think an infinite multiverse breaks the laws of probability? And it has a 100% chance of happening. Doesn't that undermine the Kolmogorov axioms? And can I explain the measure problem? Okay, so I don't know if it breaks the Kolmogorov axioms. Like, I sort of suspect there are lots of imaginable cases where there are infinite possible outcomes, and I think we'll need some probability to deal with those. I don't have a way of doing it, but I guess I think just because it's infinite, this doesn't rule out any probabilistic reasoning. If it did, I think that would be a problem, as I think God creates infinite worlds. Okay, so now the second question is about the measure problem, right? So I'll explain in a little more detail. The problem is just, if there are infinite worlds, then there are going to be infinite people who have every property. So it's a problem of figuring out how do you do probabilities there. And as far as there are infinite people who are deceived and who are not deceived, then you end up getting these really weird results where, like, your credence in you being deceived ends up being undefined. Very bad, very problematic. So that's a problem. Okay, sorry for that delay. Reflective journey. Hello.
Yeah. Hi, Matthew. Thanks for bringing me up. My English is not very good, so is that fine?
Sorry, it was a bit hard to hear you.
No, my English is not very good, so is that fine?
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. So regarding the previous discussion that you guys were having, so is will a primitive sort of concept, or what exactly is a will? Is it a faculty of mind or power of mind? So, because I think if we are taking that to be primitive, then we need to sort of make more explicit what underlies the concept of will that we're using in the simple hypothesis, right? Because it could turn out that will itself is a very complex thing, or it is a incoherent concept, or the way we are using it.
Yeah, so we're not taking will to be fundamental. We're taking to be fundamental as consciousness. And consciousness, I think it is a very simple thing in that it doesn't reduce to any further things. This is what, so I'm what's known as a dualist, where I think but neither mind nor matter reduces to the other. I think there are arguments for this. If this is true, then we're going to have to posit that mind is fundamental. And then so far as mind is fundamental and it doesn't break down to any simpler things, then minds are inevitably going to be a simple thing. And so if you just take an unlimited mind or an unlimited consciousness, where mind and consciousness are fundamental, then this is a very simple theory because it just posits a fundamental thing without limit. It would be like, imagine if, like, I don't know, I don't think there is a theory like this, but imagine you had a theory which was just physical stuff exists without limit. Just there's an unlimited physical entity. Well, if there were a way of specifying that, that would be very simple because it just takes a fundamental thing of physical stuff and imposes it without limit. If you take one of the fundamental things, mental stuff, and you impose it without limit, that's a very simple theory.
No, I get that part, but since so God willing infinite people is an explanation that is being proposed for the SIA. I mean, as far as I understand it, that for the since the prediction of or since according to SIA there should be infinite people, and we are taking that God wills it to be an adequate explanation. Uh, or the theory that we should consider it for the Bayesian analysis, right? So, in that case, what exactly is the God will sit part? Because I left a comment on your, I think, previous video, because my concern is that it is a sort of teleological explanation which after in the scientific revolution we just discarded those in favor of more explanation in terms of mechanisms. So if will is sort of a teleological explanation, that the prior that we have for that theory might itself be less based on the historical context we are currently in post enlightenment context. Did that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess I mean there was a lot there that I disagreed with. I think theism is it's a very simple, right? So I think theism is a simple theory on account of just positing a fundamental thing. Now you're saying, well, maybe the inductive track record ends up so I guess one of the things you were saying is it sounded like it was a bit hard to understand some of what you were saying, but it sounded like you were saying, in other words, God creates a lot of different stuff that's complicated. I don't think it's complicated if you have a simple thing give rise to lots of complicated stuff, because I think complexity is about the number of unexplained things, not the total number of things. It's not like you should think probably there's not an external world because it's very complicated, because the external world results from simple stuff. And there are various arguments for that I guess I could go into if you want. I think if you deny that, then you get these weird results where your credence in a fair coin ends up coming up heads, ends up being other than 0.5. Now, regarding the other point about how maybe we should discard these explanations because of the poor track record of them. So they haven't had a great track record, but I think there are two different broad models that you might have. One of the models is, there's just this constantly meddling deity who sets up the stars and the skies and the planets and so on. I think after we observe a few cases where that doesn't happen, we should have very low credence in that deity. Which is one reason why you should have a very low credence in, say, the success of Michael Behe's arguments, where it just seems like that it has this meddling deity. Now, there's another way that you could have, another kind of deity you have, that basically sets up the basic building blocks of the world, but isn't constantly meddling. Now, the inductive track record doesn't tell us between those two theories. It doesn't tell us whether, but neither of those theories predict a God that's constantly meddling all the time. And so for that reason, I don't think that the theory that there's a God who doesn't meddle, but who simply sets up the world, I don't think that theory is just confirmed by the inductive track record. And then that theory is the one that I think is right, the one that I think explains the data. It would be like, here's an analogy. Suppose that that you look in a building, and you look sort of in the interior of the building, and you look on the walls, and you think maybe the builder made this painting. You look in the painting, it wasn't made by the builder. And you say maybe the builder made the bed. Okay, you look at the bed, it wasn't made by the builder. Well, this wouldn't give you a strong reason to think the house itself was not made by the builder. It just gives you a reason to think the builder was not the kind of builder who's constantly meddling. The other point is, I actually think the inductive track record goes the other way. I think the case for theism has gotten stronger over time. I think there was one case where the case for theism got significantly weaker, which was through the discovery of Darwinian evolution. That undermined a very powerful argument for theism, which is the argument for biological life. That made it so that our argument went from being very good to being very bad. But we've now gotten lots of other arguments for theism. We've gotten the argument from fine-tuning, which was discovered in physics. We've gotten the argument from fine-tuning for discoverability, from psychophysical harmony, from anthropics, from moral knowledge. We've gotten lots of different arguments, and many of these arguments are new. So I think the inductive track record goes the other way. Maybe the inductive track record of the things that people point to, as supporting God. Many of those have been debunked. But if we look at the thing that's actually good evidence for God, I think we found more of it over time. So I think that's actually, it's evidence for theism from the inductive track record.
I mean, I would say it's too early to say, because most of these arguments are framed in, I mean, arguments get updated and the dialectics keeps on progressing. So atheist arguments are also getting updated as well. But yeah, regarding your explanation, so the God is willing or setting up the laws initially, and then he's not allowed to meddle, or if God wills it, he can change the laws of the universe. So which theory are we going with? So then God has a limitation, right? That he cannot change the laws once he has set it up.
Yeah, so
And that would come.
God is allowed to meddle. He can do whatever he wants, but he doesn't want to meddle. And there are different stories you can tell about this. I think whatever explanation you have of the problem of evil will probably cover why God doesn't meddle. So one theodicy that I like from my friends, Brian Cutter and Philip Swenson, is what they say is basically there were these archons that were tasked with making the world really awesome. They were tasked with making the world amazing. But basically, the archons, they were given a difficult task, and they basically, they kind of failed. They didn't follow through. And so the reason why why God doesn't intervene is because he has a policy of not intervening, so that the archons can be the genuine difference maker in terms of our fates, so that the archons are genuinely in charge of that, so that he won't bail the archons out if they mess up. And the reason he would set up this scheme is that the archons, if the archons help us out at great personal difficulty, then that would strengthen our relationship with the archons, and it would last forever. So that's one kind of story on which it's true. Another kind of story is that I've given this theodicy where the idea is basically just that we voluntarily choose to enter a world and undergo suffering so that we can help each other out. And then it strengthens our connections with other people because we voluntarily undergo suffering and sacrifice in the world. And the reason why God sets up a world with these universal laws that are roughly indifferent is so that we have the greater ability to sort of reform nature, to make things go well, because that gives us a greater total ability to help things out. In a world where things start out amazing, or where God's constantly meddling, we have a less great ability to help each other out and to fight against these sort of natural scourges like plagues and disease and so on. So these are some stories. You don't have to be convinced by any of them, but I think at least they make it so that it's not a totally ad hoc explanation that there's a God who would make the world, but wouldn't constantly set up the world. Because they're not in the world, I mean.
But in the Bayesian calculation, that would increase the complexity of the theory, right? If you include the theodicy, like soul building theodicy in the theory itself, then I guess the prior for that would go down, because there are multiple different theodicies, and you have to choose one of them. So, or does that not?
Certainly, theism will go down in probability if it needs a theodicy. If the world had no evil, if the world were created as a perfect paradise, the case for theism would be much stronger, right? Theism will have to invoke this kind of arbitrary and ad hoc theodicy, and that'll lower its probability. But I think even with the lower probability as a result of that, it still ends up being much better than atheism. Because I think there's really only one core problem for theism, which is explaining a kind of horrible, indifferent universe, a world that's indifferent in many ways and that's horrible in many ways to us. While the naturalist, I think they have lots of different things that their theory poorly explains. And so the theist, if they just add one extra auxiliary hypothesis, then it's smooth sailing. So they have the demon theodicy. That predicts well everything about the world. In contrast, on naturalism, I think you have a poor explanation of the anthropic data, of fine-tuning, of psychophysical harmony, of the fact that we're not in a skeptical scenario, of moral knowledge, of nomological harmony, of the fact that there are laws that exist at all, of maybe contingency. I guess I'm less sold on the contingency argument of hexate. You get a bad explanation of loads of stuff.
For each argument we can go into detail, but maybe I guess for laws existing itself, it could depend, right? Like the account for laws is human or is it nomological or governing. So only for the governing account there's a problem. But if we take the laws to be human, then I don't see the problem because we're just taking the regularities.
Isn't very implausible. But even if you are a human, I don't think it solves the problem because just the simplest ways, like even if laws are just generalizations, then technically there would be laws, but it's improbable that the laws would result in anything happening. Or like the simplest law would just be stuff just sits around forever. That's much simpler than the law that makes interesting stuff happen.
No, but the human is saying that that things happen, but whatever regularities we are observing, we are just making a generalization on that. So
right. But
the word is empirical word is the given there. So whatever is
right.
happening, and we cannot have a complete like be sure that it will always be true or hold, but that is our current best generalization at that point. At this point. Yeah.
To the human, laws are just summaries of how stuff behaves. But the thing that's surprising is that stuff behaves in any way rather than just sitting around doing nothing. It would be much simpler for stuff to just sit around doing nothing forever.
No, but it is simpler. It's not a reason for that to be the way, right? Because for a human, the impressions, whatever the impressions are, they are what they are. They are the given in experience. So we why would we theorize about the experience itself? Because those are just whatever they are. So it's like a human mosaic, right? So
but even if they are whatever they are, I think whatever they are is likelier to be simpler. And if you don't think that, then you should expect random chaos, and then humanism will fit very poorly with data because because there are way more chaotic laws, it would predict a very low chance of regularity. If you don't have any bias towards simpler laws, quote unquote, where laws are just summaries of the way stuff behaves.
No, there is no expectation for it, but yeah, I think we can argue on that point. And regarding the anthropics, I am like a bit suspicious. So is it like a completely deductive argument, or what are the like the premises for it? So are we taking in some existential premise, or because I'm a bit unclear that if we are like deductively proving the existence of more people, or we are like taking in from experience we are extrapolating, or how
the idea of the self-indication assumption is it says that from your existence serves as evidence for there being more people, where a theory that says that there are n times as many people that might be your present self, a theory that says that is n times likelier. So if a coin gets flipped, if it creates one person of heads and 10 people of tails, SIA would say you should think tails are 10 times likelier than heads because it makes your existence 10 times as likely. So the way the argument goes is, 1, SIA is true. 2, if SIA is true, then you should think that the number of people that exist is at least Beth2. 3, if the number of people that exist is at least Beth2, that fact favors theism. So then theism gets a boost in probability from there being at least Beth2 people. You can make it more precise by saying, 1, SIA is true. 2, if SIA is true, then you should think the number of people that exist is the most that there could be if there's an intrinsic maximum. If there's no intrinsic maximum, then you should think that every ascending order of infinity is likelier. Then you say 3, if there is the most, a maximum on the number of people that there could be, and that number exists, then that favors theism. 4, if not, and that just bigger infinities in the hierarchy are likelier, then that still favors theism, right? Because then atheism will probably predict a finite number or Aleph null people, while most of theism's probability mass is in higher numbers. And so then 5, thus, whatever the scenario, either there's a maximum number of possible people or there's not, that fact is evidence for theism. Sorry, I didn't have the formulation in front of me as I was laying it out. So I may have butchered the formalism slightly, but I mean, that's the basic idea. The basic idea is from the fact that you exist, you should think there are more people. Specifically, you should think the number of people that there are is the most that there could be. then that fact is evidence for theism.
No, but how is the SIA itself established? I'm asking about that. So the premise one itself.
So SIA itself is established just by reflecting on the nature of probabilistic reasoning. So there are a bunch of arguments for SIA. Let me just describe one of them, which not only will this show that any deviation from SIA is implausible, it will also show in principle why SIA is right. Okay, let's imagine one person's created, then a coin is flipped. If it comes up tails, a second person's created. So one person's created, coin's flipped. If tails, a second person's created. Suppose that you get created. Well, here's how the SIA reasoning works here. The idea is step one is that, and I can take this out in the chat, the odds you're the first person and the coin will come up heads equals the odds you're the first person and the coin will come up tails. Then the second premise is the odds you're the first person and the coin will come up tails equals the odds you're the second person and the coin has come up tails. So then from these two, it follows that tails is twice as likelier than heads, as heads. The idea is just so long as you take into account uncertainty about which of the people you are, you inevitably get the result that tails is likelier than heads. Oh, sorry, okay, I put it in the chat. It's slightly butchered with the formatting. But so one, the odds you're the first person and the coin will come up heads equals the odds you're the first person and the coin will come up tails. Two, the odds you're the second person, you're the first person and the coin will come up tails equals the odds you're the second person and the coin has come up tails. So tails is twice as likely as heads. And both of these are just very plausible premises, right? I don't think there's like the only plausible way out is to deny the first premise, in which case you think that if you're the first person, it's likelier that the coin will come up heads than tails. Then your credence in a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet coming up heads is more than 50%. So this is the first way to see SIA is right. There are a bunch of arguments for it. I'd be happy to go through more of them. But if you change around the numbers, to be clear, if you change around it so that tails makes say 999 people get created, then unless you think that tails is 1,000 times likelier than heads, then the same argument establishes that tails is 1,000 times likelier than heads, where the idea is that the odds you're the first person, the coin will come up tails, equals the odds you're the first person, the coin will come up heads. The odds you're the first person, the coin will come up tails, equals the odds you're the second person, the coin has come up tails, which equals the odds you're the third person, the coin has come up tails, and so on. So tails in total is 1,000 times likelier than heads.
Yeah, I will go through the premises because I cannot see the YouTube chat currently. But one I guess concern here would be that U is a indexical, right? So if you are trying to establish it deductively or in principle, then so U is a indexical. So if you're using indexicals, then I don't think you can establish in principle. In principle, you cannot get like any in principle stuff because you will always be indexed to the speaker who is making that claim, right? And it is a principle thing.
It's true that U is an indexical, but the point is when you're precise about which person U is, where you're uncertain about which person U picks out, when you're precise about that, you just get SIA credences, right? So when you realize the odds that you are the first person and the coin will come up heads equals the odds that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails, and the odds that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails equals the odds that you're the second person and the coin has come up tails. Anyway, you take into account your uncertainty. You know that you exist, but you don't know, okay, are you the first person in the world where the coin will come up heads? Are you the first person in the world where the coin will come up tails? Or are you the second person in the world where the coin has come up tails? And so once you take into account your uncertainty about that, then you just get exactly SIA credences falling out necessarily.
Got it. And another concern here, another reason here could be that this from a hypothetical scenario of coin flipping, we are trying to establish a principle, right? But suppose if we take like Zeno's paradox, and in that hypothetical scenario, we get the conclusion that motion itself is impossible. So, but if we just stick to the hypothetical reasoning of the setup of the Zeno's paradox, then then the conclusion that motion doesn't exist follows. But in that case, we would say that the hypothetical reasoning itself is some hypothetical reasoning itself might be flawed in this case if it is not like related to the actual claims or some empirical claims that have some other grounding other than the hypothetical itself. Did that sort of
Well, so
objection
the problem
make
in
sense?
Zeno's paradox, right, is it has a false premise, right? It has the premise. Now it's different people with different diagnoses of which premise is false, but the problem is the argument is wrong. But in my case, I've given an argument. It has a conclusion that follows from the premises. The same kind of reasoning will generalize to any SIA case, and so if it's right, then SIA is right. And so you'd have to actually show what's wrong with the argument. You can't just vaguely gesture in the direction of other arguments are wrong, right? Yes, other arguments are wrong, but okay, how's this one wrong? Particularly because we can show an impossibility proof where we can show, with Zeno's argument, I don't think you could get an impossibility proof, and if you could, then you would just want to give up one of the premises. But here we can give an impossibility proof where either you accept that your existence is n times likelier, and if it would be created by a chancy event that creates n times as many people, or you have to give up on Bayesian conditionalization, and even there it doesn't solve the problem, or you have to give up on the fact that your credence in a chancy event that hasn't happened yet should be 50%, and in fact should be anything other than like a function of how unlikely it is given that you're the first person. Sorry, I explained the impossibility proof very badly. I laid out in more detail the argument in my paper, alternatives to the self-indication assumption are doomed. Like here's one way to see it. Okay, let's imagine you're in the Garden of Eden. You're one of the first two people, but you don't know that. And let's say God has this scheme where what he does is he says, for the first two people, I'm going to have them play a game of poker. And if they get 10 royal flushes in a row, then I'm going to create a huge number of offspring. They're going to have Googleplex offspring. Okay, so you're in the Garden of Eden. You don't realize that you're one of the first two people. And then God comes to you and says, you're one of the first two people. Well, if you reject SIA, you would say, well, the theory on which there are Googleplex people doesn't make my existence any likelier. Or maybe it makes it a bit likelier, but it doesn't make it Googleplex times likelier. And so now, but the condition on there being Googleplex people, the odds I'd be the first one is 2 over Googleplex. So I'd be one of the first two is 2 over Googleplex. So now I'm super confident that there will not be Googleplex people. So now I'm confident that in a fair game of poker that hasn't been played yet, I'm going to get 10 royal flushes in a row. And that's very implausible. And just cases like this abound. And any case where SIA is applying will be structurally similar to these cases, right? All the cases where SIA is applying are cases where a theory in which there are more people ends up being more likely. But this shows that so long as it's as a chance event determines whether there are lots of people that get created, then then your credence, if it doesn't match SIA credences, and you follow Bayesian conditionalization, and even if you don't, you don't get out of the problem, that you end up getting really, really high confidence in a chance event turning out some way. So I mean, and that's only one of the arguments for SIA. There are lots of arguments for SIA. Some of them that are very convincing. So I think what I would encourage you to do is I would encourage you to sit down to read the arguments that I've given for SIA, and then tell me what you think of those arguments, rather than just sort of vaguely gesturing in the direction of maybe there's something wrong with them. Yeah, maybe there is, but I don't think there is. If you want my most comprehensive treatment of it, it comes in a blog post. It comes in a paper that's unpublished. But I have a blog post called Alternative. I have a blog post called The Master Argument for the Self-Indication Assumption is Even Better Than I Thought. And then I have my published paper on the Doomsday Argument. Those would be what I would recommend you read if you want to learn the case for SIA. Ken Olam also has a very convincing paper where he argues for SIA. I'm forgetting the name of it, but.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. I will check it out. So one just clarification. So what we are considering as people. So if people like a human organism, or can people just be any living being, or what
So
is considered?
tells you to think there are more of is not people, but it's people that you might presently be, right? So I'm gonna assume your birth name is reflective journey, okay? So SIA will say a theory that says there are, say, 1 billion reflective journeys. That theory is 1 billion times likelier than a theory that says that there's one reflective journey, assuming they have equal priors and explain the rest of the data equally well. So what it says is of the conscious beings, and actually not just people, time slices, so people at a time, of the people that you might presently be, SIA says that you should think you're equally likely. It says that the theory that says there are n times more of them predicts your present existence n times as well. So you don't have to come up with like a reference class of what a person is. What matters is those that, based on your current evidence, you might be.
So suppose based on my current evidence, the person I am is just a evolved human organism, right?
Yeah.
And then it's possible that that we get hit by a gamma ray burst or something that wipes out the human population completely on Earth, or some catastrophic event. So in that case, I would consider that it's possible all the same the class that I'm considering myself would wipe out. So would that be a counter reason, or like the reason against arguing that way, or we have to take uh, yeah the person to be more metaphysical, like soul or eternal, something that sort? Yeah, just clarifying on that.
I mean, you should have some credence in that you'll, maybe I didn't quite understand the question. You should have some credence in that you'll be hit by a comet, for example, and that you're one of the ones that will be hit by a comet. Yeah, I guess I didn't really get the question.
So if all the humans that are currently present on Earth get wiped out by a comet, then in that case, in the future, there won't be any person like me. If we are assuming that I'm a human person, right, or a human agentic, a human organism. So if my credence for that is higher, that like a very very high, that yeah, I'm a naturalistically evolved human organism, and it is possible that that the evolutionary tree or the branch that we are on can get destroyed.
That's what I want you to think that there are more of is person moments that you might presently be. So you're not a person in the future, right? You're a person in the present. Now, you might be a simulated person because you're a person in the year 2024, right? So the people in 20, 400, they're not people that you might presently be. And so for that reason, SIA doesn't give you any reason to predict that the future humans are more or less likely to go extinct or anything like that.
No, but if it is possible they can go extinct, then in that scenario, the SIA would be falsified, or will SIA, because it is an in principle thing, right? So it has to be necessarily true in that suppose possible world where all humans are wiped out.
SIA does not give you any reason to think that there are more or fewer people in the future, because no matter how many people there are in the future, it doesn't affect the number of people that you might presently be, as you're not one of the people in the future. You're one of the people in the present.
No, but SIA does give us that in future there, like in the like end of time, there would be best to, or at some time t there would be best two people. But is it possible that those people would have to be human organisms, or did you get my point?
What SIA tells you to think there are is best two people that you might presently be. So those people will include people across multiverses, right? There are lots of people across the multiverse that I might presently be. I might be the person on the Earth of one multiverse, or a person on the Earth of a different multiverse. SIA, so it tells you to think that there are best two of the people that you might presently be. Beyond that, it does not tell you anything. It does not tell you about the number of people or aliens or anything like that. I mean, I guess it tells you about the number of people that it's at least best two as an entailment, but it doesn't tell you anything directly about anything other than the number of people that you might presently be.
Got it. Okay, so it is about at the current moment that there are bits to people.
So it's not about
Yeah.
so it's not exactly about the present current moment, because it also includes people in other worlds that are spatiotemporally disconnected. And insofar as there are people, like suppose that there's suppose that there's in the year 2024, there's one copy of you, and then they make a simulation in the year 4000. Well, in SIA, you don't know whether you're the one in 2024 or the simulation. So SIA would say that you should think the theory in which there's the original you and the simulated you all is equal, that theory is going to get some boost in probability. But yeah, so that theory will get a boost in probability. But the point is that you won't get what ultimately matters is the number of people that you might presently be, or the number of time slices to be precise. So all of those people who, based on your current evidence, you can't rule out your current self being that.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll go through the arguments in the chat as well. But yeah, thanks for clarification. I had some
Can I
confusion around it could be in the future. But yeah, go ahead. Other folks can go ahead.
And just very briefly, if you send me an email, I'd be happy to send you. I have a paper where I make, I think, the most detailed existent case for SIA. So I'd be happy to send that to you if you send me your email. So yeah, shoot me an email and I'll send you the paper. But yeah, okay. I do want to answer some of the questions in the chat. I've gotten far behind in answering the chat questions. Yeah. So let's see, okay. So O1 says, I feel like all these arguments are contingent on the existence of imagined sets that I don't think we can think there exists evidence for. PHH, what's PHH? Is it supposed to be PPH? Assumes an entire set of different size states. Fine-tuning assumes the universe exists such that all its fundamental params exist in the real, similar to with anthropics, etc. I mean, I guess so. Like, it's true that there's going to be a puzzle about exactly how to do the measures, but like, this is true anytime you make a probabilistic argument about theism, right? So imagine the stars spelled out made by God. There are going to be infinite ways both for them and for them not to spell out made by God. But nonetheless, we'd want to say, okay, them spelling out made by God is evidence. Maybe there's going to be some fancy measure way of doing it. Maybe we can only get to like imprecise probabilities. But in any case, we'd want to say, that's going to be evidence, and then this is not going to be substantially different from psychophysical harmony. Okay, random video says that the events are supposed to add up to 1, but if infinite universes exist, it's hard to have the stuff add up to 1. Yeah, this is right. Infinite stuff makes it very hard to get your credences to sum to 1. I think probably like, I don't know. I have weird views about this. I think maybe you don't have to, I think maybe your credence in any mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive set of events should be 1. But I think maybe your credence across some infinite sets of events with infinitesimal probability isn't just determined by summing them, because there isn't a nice, elegant way to sum them. But okay, Vignu said, well, I guess I can just chat with Vignu. Said, I didn't understand your objection. There are Google possible laws and constants, so the probability of getting this constant is 1 over Google under naturalism. But the same is true for theism, since they are all, under all of them, valuable constants would be formed. But the point is, there's a big difference between the ones, the naturalism ones and the theism ones, which is that the naturalism ones, the theism ones, the constants we have naturally give rise to interesting and complex structures. While under naturalism, under the other ones, like if the finite cosmological constant were different, God could still make it, but he would have to use great amount of miraculous intervention. So as long as you think that there's non-trivial probability that God would make the world without using tons of miraculous intervention, which doesn't seem that unlikely. Like, insofar as God has a reason not to meddle, we could talk about theodicies that maybe give us a reason to think that, then it predicts with higher probability.
That's also possibilities, right? That's also possibilities under theism, right? We can add in like psychophysical laws or something, where Neil talks about electrons in love, something like that. Not electrons in love, but something similar. Like like I said, if the gravitational constant is somewhat higher.
You could do that, but you'd need a great degree of gerrymandering and rigging in order to get interesting stuff happening.
Yeah,
yeah.
My point is that's possible under theism, but it's impossible under my physicalism. That's my point.
Yes, it's possible under theism, but the point is the probability of it under theism is under theism. There's a decent probability. So there are two ways that God could make stuff. One of the ways is with excessive amounts of miracles and interventionism, where he has everything, the psychophysical laws be set up so that there can be information transfers all across the universe. And another way that he might do it is he might have the physical laws naturally give rise to the formation of complex structures, and those be the creatures he creates. Even if we assume there's a 99% chance he'd do it the first way, well, that means a 1% chance that he'll do it the second way. And if he does it the second way, then inevitably he'll have the laws that naturally result in the formation of complex structures. So he would finally tune the constants. It truly could still make valuable stuff if he didn't do that. But as long as you think the odds are like not insignificant that he would do it that way, then it's still going to be evidence for theism. The other point, and this is a point I make, I have a paper replying to Neil called Electrons Out of Love. The other point is that maybe God does make these worlds. Maybe God not only makes the world with our world, but he also makes the electrons in love world. And so if that's right, that predicts a bunch of worlds, including our world and the electrons in love world. Even if you think there's a 10% chance you do that, well, then it still means that there's massive evidence for our world over the electrons, over the naturalistic world, because our world predicts a bunch of worlds with our constants, just like the bunch of electrons in love world. That's what I think about the electrons in love objection.
Imagine such a law that all else is equal, the gravitational constant is somewhat higher, so the universe will get destroyed, and there is a further addition to this law that a soul will be formed. So there is a further addition. It doesn't have to be a miraculous intervention beyond physical law. It should be beyond physical law. We can imagine it as a psychophysical law. Okay, so still there is a law, but a soul is forming. So I don't think if I'm taking your theism that there is an unlimited mind and the mind is good. So under that hypothesis, I don't see any reason to expect a physical life. If someone asks me, there are all these options, there is an option that the constants are such in our world, and there is also another option that constants are a little bit different, and the world get destroyed, and there is this additional law that soul gets formed. I don't see a reason to expect this world rather than the other world where the souls are formed and they are in love. So that's my problem.
Okay, well, so I think I've given a reply. So let me say it again. First of all that you need, you don't have to think it's that likely that God would create the world over the electrons in the love world. The point is, all of the worlds that are not finely tuned are just different variations of the same world. They're a world where God basically has a world that where the laws don't naturally give rise to complex structures, and and so God has to engage in a great degree of gerrymandering in order to get the formation of complex structures. So if that's right, then wait, sorry, I'm gonna plug off my mic because it's freezing out. Give me a sec. I don't know why it keeps doing this. Very annoying. Okay, I think it should be fine now. Okay. It seems to be freezing, but okay, seems to be working now. Right. So the idea is that there are lots of worlds that are like this. They're all variations of basically the same world, where they involve a world that doesn't naturally lead to the formation of complex structures. And so God has to either add some other law in order to give rise to the formation of complex structures, or he has to just directly impute the giving rise to interesting stuff happening by designing gerrymander laws. The point is, all these are roughly the same. And so you should group them together probabilistically. You should have some non-zero credence in God making a set of laws that just gives rise to the formation of complex structures. And if you have 1% credence in that, it blows the probability of that on theism out of the water. So that's the first point, that even if you think the odds are low, the odds are not low on the order of 1 in 10 to the 50th. And if you think the odds are low in 1 in 10 to the 50th, you have made a mistake. For the laws of nothing are ever 1 in 10 to the 50th, right? You should never say, I'm confident at 1 in 10 to the power of 50 odds that some agent wouldn't do X, right? They're always, you should basically never think that, right? Especially if we can tell some story about why the agent might do X. And then the second point is, even if you think the odds are really low that God would make a world like this, insofar as God makes a bunch of different worlds, then some of the worlds would be like this. And so overall, you'd still get a lot more worlds like this in expectation on theism than on atheism.
Yeah, so I'm not like exactly convinced, but I don't want you to repeat again. So I'll just move on. But I need to. Can you spare just 1 minute for me to? I just have a doubt on utilitarianism. Just 1 minute. Can I ask something?
A rant on utilitarianism, you said?
Yeah. Something on utilitarianism. Can I ask?
Sure.
Okay. So suppose there is there are two worlds. One world there is let's imagine there is 10 utility and one person get all the utility, and there is a second world there are like 10 person and 10 utility, but the 10 utility is equally divided among all the individuals. So I have this intuition that the second world is like morally somewhat better. So what do you think? Do you have any objection, or do you have any post regarding this? Because I checked all your blog and I couldn't find anything. So it would be helpful if you could share anything on this.
Yeah, so Mike Humer has 2 papers where he argues against egalitarianism, in the sense that he argues that basically if you want to figure out how good a world is, you just look at the total value of the world. This isn't a topic I've thought about in many years, so I don't really remember all the things. Theron Plummer also has a paper called The Priority Monster where he gets an objection to it. So I guess I'd recommend looking there. If you just Google Mike Humer egalitarianism, you'll get two different papers where he lays out the case against egalitarianism. Yeah, so I get that would be the main thing. I think I had some paper that I could send you if you send me an email, where among other things that had
Okay,
some.
like how to contact you, Matthew? Like, do you have any email on your blog, or
Yeah, I have.
how should I contact you?
I have a Discord. So my Discord is it's just Omnizoid, OMNIZOID. No caps. No cap.
Can you comment or something? It would be really helpful.
Can I what? Sorry?
Can you type it on? Oh, okay. I got it. Okay,
I just typed it in the private chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I have an email that I think you can find. It's just untrappedzoid@gmail.com.
Like, are you still an objectivist utilitarian?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. See you.
Yeah. Bye. Good meeting you. Yeah, nice chatting. Hello, Faith in Films. Good.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Good to see you. Oh, actually, I was listening. Listen, I only joined because I love smart people, and you were talking, and I went, "Oh my gosh, I haven't talked to you in a long time." So I wanted to hear kind of the discussion. So, are you a Christian now?
No, I'm a generic theist.
Oh, okay. And how soon do you think it'll take before you become a Christian?
Why, I have no plans to become a Christian.
Okay. But if you had to guess, like a few months, few years, how long?
Okay, is the question conditional on me becoming a Christian? What are the odds? Like, what would I expect the timeline? I don't know, probably a few years. But I think there's a low probability that I become a Christian, because I think it's.
Oh wow. Okay. So I should know all this stuff already, but I don't. So what is psychophysical harmony? What can you explain what that concept is?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. I don't know. I would recommend probably.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I said you look like you've been talking about it for quite some time. You do not want to unpack it again.
I mean, yeah, I guess I'd recommend. So Dustin Crummett and Brian Cutter have a paper. If you just Google psychophysical harmony, you'll find it. My friend Apologetics Squared also, he has a YouTube video about it. The short answer is just there's a harmonious pairing between the mental and the physical. So your internal map, your internal conscious map of what reality is like, roughly matches the way reality is. So your perception, you perceive there's a table, and in fact there is a table. There is also the fact that you're behaviorally disposed to respond to the contents of your experience. So if you have a desire to move your limbs, then you think, I have a desire to move my limbs, and then your limbs move. What do you know? So that's pretty cool. And the idea is that on naturalism, if we think about the ways the mental and the physical could pair, there are lots of ways that they could pair that wouldn't produce anything interesting. And so it's a low probability that you get anything interesting arising in terms of our mental life. It would be much like, here's a very simple set of psychophysical laws. Maybe just any time any physical system processes information, it just has the experience of seeing a red wall. Well, if that were the psychophysical law, you would never get anything interesting, right? Because you would just get the experience of seeing a red wall across all information processing structures in the universe. And so it's very improbable that we get an interesting set of psychophysical laws that produces anything that's of any value.
So can you explain that a little bit more, like what you mean by the red wall? I understood most of what you said, but that part.
So the idea is just imagine every entity that has that processes any amount of information. All it has is the experience of just seeing a red wall. Its experience is just uniform throughout its entire life, and its experiences of seeing a red wall, just like looking at a wall that is red.
Yes.
If those were the psychophysical laws, nothing of value would ever happen. There would be no agents. We would have no grand projects or aims, and so it's very improbable that we get psychophysical laws that give rise to interesting stuff happening, rather than just something really simple that gives rise to nothing interesting.
Right. So so is it kind of basically saying that the fact that there is it's the best way I can think of it now, because I'm not familiar with this, but the fact that there is a diversity of experience is kind of indicative of some overarching kind of
it's not just a diversity of experience, it's that there are psychophysical laws that give rise to interesting conscious states. So if you think about the simplest ways or the most numerous ways there could be psychophysical laws, most of them just wouldn't be at all interesting. Most of them would just produce, some very boring mental life. Most of them would produce there being no connection between what creatures desire and how they behave.
Right.
And so for this reason, it's very surprising that we get these laws. It's a little bit like the fine-tuning argument, where the idea is with the fine-tuning argument is it's unlikely complex structures would arise. But it's like the fine-tuning argument for the mind, that it's unlikely that complex mental, even if you get complex physical structures, it's unlikely that you get any paired interesting mental lives arising.
Right. Well, so it's not limited to the diversity of experience, but you're saying that there's something more there. So then when you say that something interesting, give me an example other than like the fact that there is a table, a watch, the fact that your body is able to process all of these things. Anyway, can you explain that a little bit more? Yeah.
So one thing is there are agents that act in the world and that their desires are implemented in bodily movements. So most ways that there could be mental lives would just be random chaos. But you're not random mental chaos. You're an agent. You're able to act in the world. You're able to have thoughts about things. You're able to reflect and ponder. Your limbs move in accordance with your desires. So when you want to move your arm moves, as if by magic.
Yes.
And so if God set these things up, it makes a lot of sense that they're psychophysically harmonious. If he didn't, then it's very improbable that they would be. Sorry, Christian Nexus. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You said.
Can I just ask you about, I had one question about the SIA. Don't you think it undermines the Boltzmann brain objection to multiverse? So specifically, I thought one of your objections to multiverse is we shouldn't expect to find ourselves in a low entropy universe because high entropy universes are sufficient to give rise to Boltzmann brains or to conscious observers. But according to the SIA, you should expect to find yourself in a world with more observers than less. And low entropy universes contain more observers because in addition to Boltzmann brains, it also produces just normal evolved brains. So the most amount of brains or most amount of conscious entities would appear in a low entropy universe.
Yeah. So the kind of reasoning is right that all else equal, if a normal universe gives rise to more brains than a Boltzmann brain universe, then you should think it's not surprising that you find yourselves in a normal universe. Where it goes wrong is that it's not actually obvious. And it's probably false that normal universes give rise to more universes than Boltzmann brain universes, just because there's so many more Boltzmann brain universes. In any of the disharmonious worlds, you can get a Boltzmann brain, or at least in many of them, Well, it takes an extraordinary degree of fine-tuning to get the normal universe. So for this reason, the odds of a normal universe are much higher. For this reason, it's very unlikely, because there are just so many more disharmonious worlds, it's very unlikely that we would find ourselves in a harmonious world and in a disharmonious world. The other thing is, the worlds that are harmonious, like, it seems like if we look at just what the expected state of the world is, it's basically entropy goes up over time until we reach heat death. After heat death, there can still be boltzmann brains, and this will last forever. And so for that reason, if we just look at the expected trajectory of the universe, it seems like we'd get finite number of normal agents, unless the universe is infinite, then it would be infinite. But we get non-Boltzmann agents for a finite period of time, for tens or hundreds of billions of years or trillions of years, and then the heat death, in which case until the end of time, when time doesn't end, you could get Boltzmann brains. And so for this reason, it's surprising that a person with your experiences is in a normal universe rather than a Boltzmann universe.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Anyone else have objections they wanna raise? Anyone want to?
Well, I have a question about shrimp welfare.
Oh, I have an answer about shrimp welfare.
Why do you care about what happens to shrimp?
So here's a plausible principle. Pain and suffering is bad. If you can prevent a lot of pain and suffering at very minor cost, you ought to do that. And then it turns out that by giving to the Shrimp Welfare Project, you can prevent lots of pain and suffering at minor cost. For every $1 you give to the Shrimp Welfare Project, you can prevent literally tens of thousands of shrimp from dying a painful death. Instead, you make their deaths painless. It just so much to reduce agony that.
Why do you think shrimp experience pain?
Well, our best scientific evidence seems to point to them feeling pain. Shrimp, they respond to anesthetic. They actively crayfish actively seek out drugs. Like, crayfish can become addicted to drugs. They respond. They remember painful experiences and then avoid the area that they experienced painful experiences in the future. They make trade-offs between pain and reward. There was a very detailed report that was carried out. There were two. One was carried out by Rethink Priorities. One was carried out by some UN organization, I think it was, on shrimp and other decapod consciousness. And they both concluded that decapods are, according to our best evidence, conscious. And I think this is right. If you look at the evidence, I have a long blog post called "All the Species of Significantly Debated Consciousness Are Conscious," where I lay out the case for that in more detail. But even if you think there's only like a 10% chance that they're conscious, just the effectiveness is so insane that it ends up being really high expected value, even given a low credence in shrimp being conscious.
Okay, I get it. So, but don't you think all of those behaviors are possible without any sort of consciousness? So, for instance, you can get complex pain avoidance behaviors in rats who don't feel any pain. So, for instance, if their spinal cord is cut, you can still get complex pain avoidance behaviors, even if there's no pain responses or no pain information transmitted to the central nervous system. So why does complex behavior in a shrimp? Why is that evidence for pain, conscious pain perception?
Well, so I don't think what you're saying about rats is true. I think in the case where, like, there are cases where rats, their some part of their brain, I think some cortex is removed, and they continue behaving as if they're in pain. But some people think they're not. But I think they probably are. But you can still get some kinds of reflexive response. But it seems like the kind of like, broad scale trade-offs between pain and reward that you get in other creatures. You need a central nervous system. You need to experience actual pain for it. So, like, for example, here's one way shrimp will behave. A shrimp, if it gets injured, it'll spend time grooming its wound. And
yeah, but you can get that without pain.
Well, and it'll
sort of response without pain.
Sorry. Well, let me finish the sentence. It'll spend a longer time. It'll make a coordinated trade-off between eating and grooming its wound. So to, like, if it's injured, then it'll take it. It won't eat for a little while so that it can spend more time grooming its wound. Now, in theory, you could have a robotic system that does that. But the point is, insofar as it has a central nervous system that bundles together many sources of information and processes nociceptory signals, and it seems to behave in all the kind of standard ways as if it were in pain, and there's no good a priori reason to think it's not in pain. It certainly acts like it's in pain. If you've ever seen, say, a lobster boiling in a pot, all these things make it, I think, a reasonable inference to think probably it feels pain, especially because there's evolutionary reason for it to feel pain. So I think it's not guaranteed that it feels pain, but I think like our best evidence seems to point towards that conclusion.
Okay, so here's the study from 2001. Grau et al. Have demonstrated that much of the pain behavior of rats, while seemingly mediated by a conscious experience of pain, can be explained by complex patterns in the spinal cord alone. For instance, rats still have a pain withdrawal and tail flick reflex, even when spinalized at birth. Spinalized means that their spinal cord is cut.
Right, so they have a reflex, right? They
Right.
like they're still reflexive responses, but they don't. But I mean, I'd have to look more into the rat case because I haven't looked at it carefully. But my understanding is that while you can get creatures that don't have experiences, you can get them having like some kind of reflex, some kind of reflexive response. You can't get them making these sort of like durable, coordinated, long-term decision making as if they were in pain. So, for example, you wouldn't get from if it doesn't feel pain, you wouldn't get it avoiding areas where it was shocked before, because it would have no reason to want to avoid those areas. It doesn't have any conscious experience of pain in those areas.
But even
But
humans can engage.
I do think this is all largely beside the point. It doesn't so much matter if the odds of shrimp being conscious are 30% or 70%, so long as the odds are like not like 0.001%. It just you help so many. You helped like 15,000 for just $1. The marginal dollar looks like it helps out 20,000.
Well, what do you think?
As long as there's
even impossible?
As long as there's let me finish the sentence. As long as there's even a plausible case for thinking maybe they're conscious, then it ends up having really high expected value.
What do you think the possibility of shrimp being conscious is just zero? Because you need you need a cortex in order to experience pain. Shrimp don't have a cortex specifically. They don't have
do you
an
think octopi
cortex.
don't have a cortex? Do you think octopi aren't conscious?
I don't think they're conscious.
Okay.
So
well, I think if you look at how octopi behave, octopi are very smart. They behave in ways that sure makes it seem as if they're conscious. The same is true of fish. The same is true of like octopi. They have really good memories. They can recognize faces. There are videos online that you can find of an octopus like squirting water at people they don't like. It's possible that they're doing all this unconsciously, but it seems like a very bad theory, particularly because there have been studies on rats where sorry, what was the brain region you said? I forget the name.
The anterior cingulate cortex.
Yeah. So where it was removed, and then rats still ended up behaving relatively normally. There are also humans in whom it's been removed, and in the humans they don't behave normally, but they still behave in ways such that it seems like a reasonable inference to think they're feeling conscious. The other point is, so like there's a big scientific debate about this. There's a high degree of uncertainty. Very smart people disagree. Like it seems like the prevailing view is that animals are conscious. Sorry, not animals in general, but that even decapods are conscious. Certainly the fish are conscious, and even more certainly that octopi are conscious. Now, insofar as there's like a heated scientific debate about it, it seems very dogmatic and irrational to be extremely confident in the results of it. Like you should, when there are smart people who disagree about this, you should never be more than like 90% confident in any view. But even if you're 90% confident that they don't feel pain, even a very low probability of them feeling pain, it ends up having extremely high expected value.
I mean, we can only determine if somebody's pain through behavior or through studying neuroanatomy. And shrimp have very little neuroanatomical similarities to humans. So for instance, there are certain areas in the brain in humans which are required for pain, like the anterior cingulate cortex, which are present in things like in animals like rats, but are absent in octopi and mollusks. So and in terms of behavior, yeah, you can get the same sort of behavior. You can get very complex non-conscious behaviors in humans. So for instance, during sleepwalking, people can avoid certain areas. People can engage in very complex behaviors without any consciousness at all. So
I mean, they don't engage in that complicated of behaviors. Like
what they can drive. That's pretty complex.
but I mean, that's mostly following things that they've remembered to do. Like they don't, the kinds of behaviors that are displayed by shrimp, where they display aversive learning over time. This is not something that sleepwalking humans display. But I mean, so so it's true. You could have a theory on which I think Brian Key had a paper called "No Cortex, No Cry" or something like that. You could think that this cortex is needed to feel pain on the grounds that it's needed in humans, or you could think maybe it's needed in humans. I mean, it's not even clear that it's needed in humans for us to feel pain. There's dispute about that. I remember there's like this long like debate manual between I forget the names of the people, but I linked to it and I discuss it in my post about whether shrimp feel pain. So there's like this long debate about this, and even in people, it's not obvious that these brain regions are needed. But I mean, even if they're needed in people, it's not clear that they're needed writ large, and in fact, it's pretty unlikely. So the way that humans see is very different from the way that shrimp see. But that doesn't mean shrimp can't see. It just means we and shrimp see in different ways. So given that we and shrimp can see in different ways through different sensory different sense organs, well, it's not implausible that the things that are needed for consciousness are different in humans and shrimp. And I don't know, I give a bunch of reasons to think this is likely right in the paper. Or sorry, not the paper, in the article. One point is just that if we look at the inductive trend, there's been this long history of us underestimating the extent to which animals feel pain. The second is just like they behave in normal ways as if they're in pain. They try to get away. Like I think this makes it a reasonable inference to think it's decently likely that they're in pain. Just like even if you haven't looked in a dog's brain, if you cut a dog and the dog like runs away and whimpers, it's reasonable to think that the dog feels pain. And I claim there's a similar thing here. There's also sort of evolutionary reason to expect them to feel pain. The purpose that pain serves in us, where it gets us to behave in ways where we avoid
Doesn't the psychophysical harmony argument undercut that? It just says there's no evolutionary purpose to pain because you can get the same sort of behavior. So for instance, you can get a scenario in which bodily damage causes the smell of cheese causes avoidance behavior. So you don't need pain in order to get
tells us that there's a
sort of
logically possible scenario in which you have creatures that behave like us, but that have very different experiences. But it doesn't. So it has that, but it doesn't establish that consistent with the physical laws, it's possible, or that there are natural ways for it to arise. And I suspect it's not possible, right? It would be very weird if if our psychophysical laws were such that they produced harmony in humans, but in like rats, they just produced wild radical disharmony. And in shrimp, they produced wild radical disharmony. I think.
Did
like,
you say? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Or no, yeah. So I think whatever the explanation is of psychophysical harmony in humans will be in terms of certain laws, and then presumably those laws will also produce harmony in other creatures. By the way, I do want to wrap up kind of soon because I'm getting kind of hungry and want to eat food. But so I guess if you have a final statement.
No. I was just wondering what your thoughts on shrimp welfare. Yeah, I personally don't think animals like fish and shrimp experience any pain at all, because I think a cortex is necessary for consciousness. So, for instance, people who have their anterior cingulate cortex removed don't feel any pain at all, don't experience pain as unpleasant. And we can only extrapolate from our experience in our neuroanatomy.
But I mean, what if? So, do you think shrimp can see?
They can discriminate between certain forms of visual information, but they can't see in the sense that humans can.
Well, maybe they don't. They see in different ways, but I think they're still seeing. So similarly, I think it could be that shrimp have the ways that shrimp have experiences. The brain regions that give rise to their experiences are different from the brain regions that give rise to our experiences. Just like the brain regions that give rise to shrimp seeing are different from the brain regions that give rise to us seeing. I also think, like, I feel like insofar as your view implies that octopi aren't conscious, that's just octopi are obviously conscious. Just look at how they behave. Like, they behave like underwater miniature dogs, except evil. I don't know. I think insofar as the view implies that no invertebrates are conscious, it's just very implausible. And the other point is that even if you think shrimp probably don't feel pain, even a low probability of shrimp feeling pain is enough to take their interests very seriously, because you can help out so many of them at small cost.
Yeah, we agree. on that point at least. Thank you.
Yeah. Wait, sorry. So do you agree that it's good to give to the Shrimp Welfare Project just on the grounds of just like low probability of high reward?
Probably, but I never heard of it.
Yeah,
David?
I guess if you want, so I have an article on my blog called "The Best Charity Isn't What You Think." So I make the case for giving to the Shrimp Welfare Project there. So I would encourage all of you to check it out. Much more important than the irrelevant bullshit about God.
Thank you.
Stuff.
Sounds good.
Much more important that people are helping the shrimp than what they think about God. But anyway, yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. Good chatting with both of you. Yeah, see you around.